Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of What If Deku was Aizawa's soulmate? If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. Chapter 61. Notes. Okay, here is the third chapter. Updates will be scheduled as regular now that I can settle back in with school and work. Enjoy! See the end of the chapter for more notes. Monday rolled around and no one wanted to get out of bed. The temptation to call in sick and keep Midoriya home was too great. And yet, with the final exams Wednesday, they had no time to do so. Good morning, Midoriya called, placing a cup of coffee on both of their nightstands as well as a small pastry. I got up early and got something sweet for breakfast. And that's why I love you, Yamada mumbled, taking a much-needed sip of coffee then sighed. It's not the only reason, but it's on my list. I know, I love you too, both of you, Midoriya giggled, then dropped a rather large binder on the bed. I didn't show you guys yet, but I figured as two of the teachers in the final exams you would have to know who's paired up with who. I may get my kisses revoked for the day for this one. You alphabetized it? Duh. Midoriya watched as Aizawa flipped to his page, one of the first ones, his eyes tired but still darted across the margins of the pages, then flipped to look at the students he was teaching. You really need to update the profiles. They were almost a year old, it seemed. Don't worry, they are updated in the margins with everything you would need to know about the student and their quirk. Not to mention small things they work on with their soulmate in case the teacher wanted to get more mental than physical when it came to helping or testing them. He crawled onto the bed to point at the colors. The ones with red, only a few have the tendency to act highly inappropriate in terms of harassment and fighting. Those with a mental block, something you can help fix, is in green dash. Izuku, we love you, but wait until we have finished our coffee before you continue. It's obvious you put so much work into this and we want to be awake to process it all, Yamada replied, flipping to his page and practically screeching using his quirk. I am wide awake now. Izuku, what were you thinking? Let me, that's too good. Aizawa started to laugh silently, his face flushing red slightly. It's obvious you would take a liking to Ojiro. It's essentially a loud versus louder fight, but Koda needs help speaking up. Their anxiety is too much at times, and are afraid to even use their quirk. This is why they can utilize it more given the right environment for this, as Ojiro can use her quirk in any way in any environment, but Koda needs to learn how to use their quirk more in environments that aren't suited to their quirk. I don't get it, why a forest then? Yamada asked. Midoriya rolled his eyes then pointed to his quirk. Ani voice, he can talk to any animals including bugs. Hisashi dash. Izuki, you know I hate bugs. Which is why I figured I wouldn't be getting kisses today. He replied almost immediately then sighed. We put him in the forest at UA without animals readily available, and even if somewhere, most are too sensitive to your quirk and Jiro's dash. Anyone is, Aizawa added, taking another sip of coffee. Exactly, but the bugs and small creatures aren't. You're lucky I'm even giving you a warning, and I would say you have the easier pair compared to Sho. Who does he have? Shoto and Yamamo. I will gladly teach headphones and bugs, he replied, pulling the binder towards him to read more about their quirks and the tips in the margins. Don't complain, I get one with 2 quirks and another that can make anything dash. That isn't alive, Midoriya chimed in. Aizawa took a sip of his coffee then sighed. Anything that isn't FING alive, he grumbled, mentally preparing for the fight with 2 powerhouse kids. Well, now that you've seen that dash, he shut the binder then tucked it under his arm. Get ready for work. They both groaned. The idea sounded terrible to them, and yet the idea that their soulmate was already awake, dressed, and made breakfast was a tad heartbreaking to them. Why did you get up so early? Yamada asked, placing the half-drank cup of coffee on the nightstand. Couldn't sleep. It wasn't a lie. There were times when he didn't fall asleep with his soulmates that he would just stay up all night. Why didn't you join us? Aizawa asked, wrapping his arms loosely around Midoriya, who in turn wrapped his arms around his waist. You guys looked happy and I had things to do still. He gestured to the binder then the table where a notebook sat open, a red one. Just because we looked peaceful sleeping doesn't mean we were happy. Never think we don't want you in our bed. Yamada bit back, pulling his breathes on. I know, I just couldn't get my mind to calm down for a few moments. If I don't fall asleep early. His voice trailed off. Both men knew what he was talking about as previous jobs had them staying up until the early hours of the morning. I get it, we both get it, Aizu, but it's not healthy. Actually took me years to figure it out, but don't listen to show he has yet to figure out how to balance his nightlife and his day job. Yamada whispered the second part loudly, making Aizawa groan and roll his eyes. He let go of Midoriya and walked towards the closet where his hero uniform hung. Well, you have 10 minutes to get your hair up and to get dressed, Hizashi, Midoriya sang. Both his soulmates started to curse, scrambling for their respective spots while he walked towards the living room, placing food into bentos and serving breakfast into small bowls. He had figured early on that neither liked to eat a lot in the morning but rather a big dinner later. What are you doing? Yamada asked. He had a brush in hand and half his hair up. With a smile, Midoriya answered. Making your bentos? Yamada pressed a kiss to his cheek as a thank you and continued to put his hair up. The older man didn't even bother checking to see what he was doing, or rather the time. Aizu, are you ready to go? It was about 10 minutes later. Both his soulmates had gotten up and were dressed and ready to go. Meanwhile, Midoriya had set the table for a nice breakfast. Izuku, we don't dash. We don't have to be at the school for another half hour, he replied, waiting for them to sit down. I just wanted a nice breakfast before you guys overwork yourselves for the final exams. You dash. Neither of them could find it in themselves to be angry at him. Sure, he woke them up at the butt crack of dawn, but he was doing it to keep their sanity in check. Thanks for making breakfast, Aizawa grumbled. Sitting down slowly, Yamada followed and sat down with him. Together they ate breakfast happily. Small jokes were passed and soon it was time for them to go to school. Or rather, Aizawa and Yamada had to face hell while Midoriya laughed and encouraged them. So Midoriya, Minetta started, both teens having walked in together, though it was Minetta who approached him. Your soulmates are hosting the final exams, right? A lot of the staff are. Why? He asked. Minetta smirked and continued. So you know what the final exam is, right? He asked. Midoriya nodded. I helped plan it, of course. He didn't see any harm in explaining this. Minetta's eyes widened in shock, then he proceeded to smile. So you can tell us what it is? Nope. Midoriya turned away from him. The smaller teen groaned and walked around his desk. That's pretty selfish, Midoriya. You don't want to see us fail, do you? He asked. Midoriya's eyes softened up. He flashed a pitted gaze towards him, then sighed. No dash, Minetta smiled widely, but I want to see you fail. Midoriya smiled to himself, standing up and greeted Iida and Todoroki at the door. Todoroki, Iida, Midoriya knows what's on the final exam and he won't tell us. Minetta huffed. If there was anyone that was going to get him to talk, it would be them. Can you tell us? Todoroki asked. Midoriya shook his head, then the fated pair turned to the much shorter and much hated teen. He said no, respect that. Todoroki said simply. Midoriya happily grabbed his hand. Platonically, he felt happily bound to them, but romantically his heart would always belong to his soulmates. But that's not fair, he planned it. I say Nedzu let you have too much power, Iida chimed in, knowing how crazy Midoriya could be at times. Is the test your version of fun? Very much so, he replied, leaning his head against Iida's shoulder. What, are you bound to two more guys? Minetta asked. Midoriya shared a glance with them that read, go along. So what if I am? He asked. Aizawa was leaning against the door, watching as well. He could feel the bond radiating his anxiety, but letting him know it was okay was all the reassurance he needed to continue this stunt. That's disgusting. First you're bound to two older men and now two more guys in our class. Midoriya dashed. He snickered, his smile turning into a sneer. I think you're aware. Excuse me? Iida and Todoroki asked at the same time, leaving no room for Midoriya to say anything. Unlike romantic bonds, platonic bonds were there for the comfort, for the love friends hold between the other that you sometimes couldn't find with romantic bonds. Midoriya didn't know, but Todoroki and Iida had already accepted him into a platonic bond. They only await a conversation with his soulmates and Midoriya himself. What? It's true. The area had suddenly dropped in temperature. Todoroki stalked towards him, his hand ablaze. It's not true, and even if it was, I think you should keep your mouth shut, was all he said to the teen, then walked back over to Midoriya, comforting him with the warmth of his quirk. Guys he didn't want to admit it, but this was nothing in terms of insults, but he was a tad overjoyed with the fact that they felt the need to protect him. Iida had already turned around, searching for his soulmate and their teacher while Todoroki stood guard protectively. Sensei I heard, Minetta. Aizawa nodded his head towards Iida, then walked into the rather empty classroom. Have anything to say? Aizawa activated his quirk, using his scarves, and snatched the teen up quickly. Not only do you have multiple warnings against you just from the girls alone, but now you have gone to other lengths to threaten my soulmate? Midoriya at this point believed everyone around him was a drama queen's or insults didn't faze him as much anymore. But Aizawa didn't say anything. Instead he pressed a kiss to Midoriya's forehead, then walked out of the class, dragging Minetta behind him, literally. Are you okay? Iida asked first. Midoriya nodded, still very confused. Yet, actually no, what just happened? He asked. No one has stood up for him like that before. Such a kind gesture is nice, but after so many, your brain starts to go elsewhere. Can we talk in private? Todoroki asked. Midoriya nodded slowly, unsure as to where this was going. We can talk in here, he mumbled, walking towards the door, then closing it quickly and locking it. Is something wrong? How do you even begin to ask this? Iida had muttered. Todoroki gripped his hand gently through the anxiety was prevalent in their bond. We want you to join us. What? Midoriya's eyes flew open in shock. Iida shook his hands wildly, dropping Todoroki's in the process. No, he faced Todoroki, then Midoriya. No, well yes, though Shoto didn't do a proper job explaining it. Leave it to his blunt soulmate to jump the gun. Yes, we want you to join us, but platonically, not romantically. Though the offer stands for that too if they leave you, Todoroki added. Iida's face was stuck with a blush Midoriya didn't know was humanly possible. I would love to join you, platonically of course, I just need to talk to my soulmates about this. Midoriya bound up to them, wrapping both his arms around their necks, trying to pull them into a group hug. Unlike a romantic bond, platonic bonds don't have a mark, nor do bonds grow like romantic ones, so emotions aren't shared. But through healthy communications, some of the healthiest platonic bonds can turn romantic in due time. The sound of a key being entered into the lock broke the happy trance they were in. Midoriya turned around, an arm slung over both his best friends. Aizawa. I platonically bonded with them, Midoriya said suddenly, cutting off Aizawa who was walking in. There is nothing you can do to stop me, it's healthy and not romantic. Wasn't going to, was all he said, leaving both Todoroki and Iida in a state of shock. Sensei? Iida questioned. Aizawa looked at them with a tired gaze. It seems to deal with Minetta was harder than he had anticipated. You make him happy. Besides, Hizashi and I will be out at the same time for hero work, and we all know what Izuku is like alone. He responded. Todoroki and Iida nodded while Midoriya stood there in shock. I'm not that bad alone. He stopped talking. The moment he had said something they all held the same really, looks. I can read the room, and you're all saying the same thing. You broke your arm to get me to use my quirk. You challenged the League of Villains to save me and the class. You challenged someone named the Hero Killer. Midoriya groaned loudly. His soulmate was ready to go on while Todoroki and Iida laughed to themselves. Having him in their lives like this would only make things more interesting. Okay, I get it. Continue your sappy giving away speech. He answered, resting his head on Iida's shoulder. There is nothing else to say. They make you happy. We won't be here all the time due to hero work, and it's healthy to hang around soulmates your age. Aizawa stopped shuffling the papers, then looked up, the deadness in his eyes making him even scarier. It better not turn romantic. There is only one time either of us will allow it to turn romantic, and that's after we are presumed dead. We won't get angry at you either if we somehow end up alive and you turn the bond into a romantic one. Hizashi waited 15 years for me, we wouldn't want Izuku to wait that long alone. Midoriya rolled his eyes, slumping onto Iida dramatically. I am surrounded by drama queens, was all he said, making the four of them burst into laughter. Midoriya stopped laughing to observe the room, a smile still plastered on his face. It was times like these he appreciated when people were happy and cared for the other. He didn't want to relive his past, and as of now, he was far from doing so. Notes. I will say this is my favorite one, besides the fact that Minetta got booted out, but for other reasons as well. Smiley face. Here is your little sneak peek to tomorrow's chapter. Midoriya couldn't help but look across at Shinso, whose gaze kept flickering from the board to his paper, then what he thought was quick and unnoticeable to Kaminari and Ojiro. Kaminari seemed to notice this, as he was trying to comfort Ojiro without hurting Shinso. He couldn't shake the weird feeling he had, but making sure his soulmate was okay was his priority. I think I found another three-way bond. Chapter 62. Notes. So this is the first chapter of 2 that won't have Midoriya's full POV. It has like half of his POVing, as it's not really his but rather centered around him. After this chapter the next will full be centered around people. Smiley face enjoy. See the end of the chapter for more notes. Today is the last warning I give for your exams, Aizawa announced to the class, his back against the chalkboard, blatantly ignoring the fact that Midoriya refused to sit at his seat and rather sat on Todoroki's lap. Iida didn't complain, nor did Todoroki, but both had pale blushes on their face. It's true, Aizawa continued, Midoriya did come up with part of your exams. I will tell you this much, you are partnered together. And seeing as how Midoriya knows you very well, some of you may even want to ask him for help when it comes to furthering your quirk. He was given the task of pairing you up. Midoriya, are they funny? Uraraka asked. Some students looked at him as he nodded, leaning back against Todoroki. With the secret partners, very much so, but most of the pairs took me a while to put together, as I didn't want someone to overpower the other, and some worked too well. That being said, soulmates, for obvious reasons, won't be paired together. Obviously, you can see each other before you take your test, but during your test, you won't see them. He explained. Quite a few of his classmates sighed. Aizawa took this as his cue to continue talking. You will be happy to hear, especially for the female students, that Minetta is no longer allowed in Class 1A or in UA for that matter. This warranted cheers to erupt from the class, mainly from the girls, but a few guys had cheered as well. And since my soulmate has a way of convincing people, we already have a new student lined up, and he will be taking the final exam to keep his spot in the class. The door slid open. Some of the girls tensed up, as people with purple hair haven't boded well for them. Ojiro stiffened up. His tail, that usually flopped around lazily when he was thinking or concentrating, had stopped moving. Their eyes met, and yet instead of looking away in shame, they held a saddened gaze. Kaminari seemed to sense something too. He lifted his head, having been occupied by Mina's notes. His eyes widened in shock, but he dismissed the feeling almost instantly. Introduce yourself, Aizawa prompted. Shinso stood by the podium with a heavy frown, his eyes constantly flickering to Ojiro and Kaminari. I'm Shinso Hitoshi from Class 1C. I'm not here to make friends, he said simply. Most of the class had looked towards Midoriya, their faces painted in shock. Midoriya only smiled, waving at him, though the smile he wore wasn't for the reasons Shinso thought. It was more of a challenge accepted smile, and the class knew, even his soulmate knew, as he was trying to cover his smile with his scarf. You can sit in Minetta's seat. If you stay, I will adjust the seating to keep you in alphabetical order. Aizawa pointed to the empty seat across from Midoriya's, but he still hadn't moved from Todoroki's lap in the back of the class. Midoriya couldn't help but look across at Shinso, whose gaze kept flickering from the board to his paper, then what he thought was quick and unnoticeable to Kaminari and Ojiro. Kaminari seemed to notice this, as he was trying to comfort Ojiro without hurting Shinso. He couldn't shake the weird feeling he had, but making sure his soulmate was okay was his priority. I think I found another three-way bond, Midoriya whispered to Todoroki, subtly pointing at Shinso, then Kaminari and Ojiro. Since when have you been wrong? Todoroki answered back, rather comfortable with Midoriya on his lap. He was tempted to fall asleep, in all honesty. I'm not always right, he started, prompting Iida to turn around and stare at him in confusion. You gave yourself a quirk, you read others' quirks, and I have yet to see you inaccurate in your readings. He shouted, though it sounded like his normal level of speech, causing a few heads to be turned. Is Midoriya? Aizawa rolled his eyes at his slip-up. Do you need to be separated? No, sir, he smiled coolly, leaning his head back against Todoroki's shoulder, a smirk present on his face. Izuku, it was his only warning, and even the class knew. He done f'd up. Sorry. Don't. Sensei, Aizawa rolled his eyes and shook his head. His soulmate was going to be the very death of him. As I was saying, the final exams will be held at the school. I cannot specify which training ground but know it can be any of them. He continued, keeping his gaze away from Midoriya and Todoroki. Any questions? When will the written test be? Midoriya asked, knowing his classmates wouldn't think of this but rather the physical portion of the test. Next week, 1A has the right to reserve the testing grounds before other classes, but as a school-wide event, everyone takes their exams together. He responded, watching as Midoriya's attention slipped to Shinso, who was mentally panicking. Afraid for the test or the idea his soulmates are in the class with him? Midoriya thought, watching as he scribbled something down on a piece of paper, scratched it out, and tried again. Sending a note? I think he's sending a note to one of them, might be an apology to Ojiro, Midoriya whispered to Todoroki, their heads faced forward but gazes held on the new student. After what seemed like an eternity, the purple-haired boy tore the paper off and tapped the student next to him, Shoji. Shoji looked at the folded paper. A name was probably scribbled on top, then passed it to Kaminari, who as Ojiro's soulmate thought to open it. Kaminari lifted his head quickly, looking over at Shinso, then tapped Ojiro, though it seemed more like a shocking punch. Look, he whispered, showing him the neatly written characters on the paper. Both boys looked up at Shinso, whose face was redder than a tomato, then back at the paper. I'm sorry, can we talk? Was what the note said. Ojiro had this perpetuating fear that the moment he met Shinso again he would only taunt him as he did during the sports festival. Kaminari was aware of it and had steered clear of him as well, but now that he was in their class and wanted to talk it was a different story. Do you want to? Kaminari asked. The apology was obviously for his soulmate but he didn't want to force him. Only if you come with me, he answered. Aizawa was still talking about the exams but pretended to pay no attention to the soulmate drama happening towards the back of his class. As he noticed and felt the amusement in the bond coming from Midoriya. He sees everything, is what he thought, shaking his head, and continuing the lecture. Shinso looked up at Aizawa, then looked over at Ojiro and Kaminari, who nodded to his request. He mentally cheered but tried to keep his mask steady. It failed slightly when he scoffed and smiled to himself. Ojiro and Kaminari weren't going to say anything to the other when the bond pulsed and radiated happiness and slightly longing. The bell rang, signaling everyone to leave. Aizawa, who usually lingered for a bit, grabbed Midoriya and ushered him out. No one was going to say anything, like the look on his face was evident enough to stay clear of them. Once the classroom was empty the trio approached the other. Rather, Shinso kept a distance while Ojiro and Kaminari held hands. What did you want to talk about? Kaminari asked. Shinso had wanted to apologize in private, but when there is a soulmate involved you don't argue. His brain was so muddled that the idea of apologizing and yet keeping them happy that he didn't know what to say. Ojiro wanted to tell him to keep his mouth shut but he paled when he realized he spoke. Screwing his eyes shut, Ojiro waited to have another memory gap. I did this? Shinso asked, the horror dawning upon him that this student, his potential peer and friend, was so afraid to speak to him that he didn't even want his soulmate to speak to him. What did you think was going to happen when you used your quirk on a group of people? Kaminari questioned. He didn't like to get angry or show anger for that matter, but his soulmate is terrified to lose time once again and the source of the fear was standing in front of them. I just dashed. What? He asked. He felt the grip on his hand tighten. Looking down, Kaminari sat back down quickly. Ojiro was on the brink of tears. Are you okay? He nodded, afraid to open his mouth and speak again in front of him. Shinso shook his head, picking his stuff up, and started to walk out. This was a mistake, was all they heard as he slammed the door open and stormed out. Mashi, Kaminari started, his brows furrowing slightly. Dudes, do you feel that too? Empty? He asked. There were times he had felt this, and that was only when Kaminari shut the bond down to focus on something, never on purpose, but sometimes he was so driven to do a basic task that it happened. Yeah. He rattled his fingers against the table. His mind kept coming to the same conclusion, but he kept bringing it away. You don't think Mashi, I don't know what to think, he muttered, leaning back in his chair. I can't be the only one to say that I felt that there was something off in this bond. But you're not, he replied, shaking his head. Did you feel anything when you first met him? He asked. Ojiro shook his head no, his grip tightening on Kaminari's hand. I don't remember much when I first met him. He seemed nice, and then I woke up to the sound of the alarm going off. It was over and I have no memory of ever competing, he replied. Kaminari pulled him into a slightly awkward hug with the desks in the way. He knew the story as Ojiro would oftentimes wake up in fear. Neither knew why it affected him so much, and yet he has lived in an unresolved fear and paranoia of the teen he never thought he was going to see again. I don't think you're going to like this, but I dash. He's our third Denki and we got off to a bad start, so maybe. He felt his mouth go dry. His brain was telling him everything that could go wrong with this idea, but his heart was screaming just as loudly, telling him everything that could be right with this. Ojiro has settled letting his brain run rampant with paranoia and fear. For once he was going to listen to his heart. He listened when he met Kaminari and it brought him some of the happiest moments of his life. Maybe we should try again. He finished nodding to himself. Once the words hung in the air, they no longer felt like a bitter pill to swallow. I want to talk to him and try again, Denki. Then let's go find him. He's not going to wait around forever. They grabbed their bags and began the hunt for Shinso. Notes. Well, this chapter was absolutely adorable and I love to write it. Here is today's sneak peek. I said leave me alone. I hurt you enough. I don't want to hurt you again. He snapped, sniffling slightly. Fear rose in their bonded pair. Kaminari reached out, his hand resting on his shoulder though Shinso leaned away, pulling back from the touch that made the pain stop for even a second. What part of I don't want to hurt you do you not understand? He asked. The pair finally heard the hurt in his voice masked by the anger he was trying to project. I'm a villain. All I do is hurt people, and if you come any close I will use my quirk on you. Chapter 63. Notes. I will not lie, what you have seen with Midoriya is not typical teenage horniness. May I present to you a chapter showcasing typical teenage horniness? Smiley face. See the end of the chapter for more notes. Shinso felt the tears well up. He hadn't cried in a few years. Why were two teens he hadn't really talked to making him feel so pathetic? Damn it, he growled, pinching the bridge of his nose, trying to will away the sadness and disappointment. The moment their eyes met things clicked and he hated that people were right, that when you met your soulmate things would click, your heart just knew who you belonged to and he hated it. He was vulnerable, he let himself be open to them, and what happened? They criticized him. Didn't even give him the chance to speak. No, that's not what happened, he sighed, stopping in the hall and rubbing his eyes carefully. He didn't want any signs of his little emotional outburst to be visible. Really, though, it was his fault that this even occurred in the first place. He relies on his quirk. He thought that if he didn't fight for his spot, if he would have made them listen even for a few seconds, that things would be better. That maybe he would be recognized as a hero that is fit to be in one. Instead, his class ridiculed him. Only a villain would use their quirk like that. Villain. A label he hasn't escaped since childhood, and it seemed in this fanciful world of heroes, he hasn't escaped it either. For once, I want to be called the hero. He whispered to himself, hoping that if he said it enough, maybe just maybe it might come true. Why can't you be? A voice asked, his head whipped around in shock only to see the familiar blondes standing hand in hand with sad smiles on their faces. He instantly turned around. No one was ever supposed to see him this week. Go away, he hissed, keeping his gaze on the wall in front of him. The tears stung his eyes. He was trying his best to will them away, but they kept flowing. His heart yearned for something, and for now, crying after months of a dry spell, was all it was going to get. Shin dashed. I said leave me alone. I hurt you enough. I don't want to hurt you again. He snapped, sniffling slightly. Fear rose in their bonded pair. Kaminari reached out, his hand resting on his shoulder though Shinso leaned away, pulling back from the touch that made the pain stop for even a second. What part of I don't want to hurt you do you not understand? He asked. The pair finally heard the hurt in his voice masked by the anger he was trying to project. I'm a villain. All I do is hurt people, and if you come any close I will use my quirk on you. Ojiro tensed up. He logically should have walked away. Instead, he tightened his grip on Kaminari's hand and sighed. No you won't, he answered. Like a cornered animal, Shinso turned around, forgetting about the tears free falling. He opened his mouth, but the sorrow held in their eyes and yet the prevalent smiles made his heart clench. I dashed he's always messing. things up, he can't ever live in peace when all he does is hurt others. A sob crawled up his throat, he pressed his hands to his mouth, suppressing it, then in a shaky whisper, spoke again. I'm so sorry. Almost instantly, Ojiro pulled him into a tight hug, tears pricked his eyes but he didn't do anything to stop them. For months he has waited for two things, for the reason why the bond felt so empty and to hear him apologize. And yet as he held him in his arms, he only feels one thing. But here is this person, broken and crying in his arms, and yet he is an answer to his questions, his doubts that Kaminari was really his fated, doubting the fear he felt for him. It all ceased as his muddled apologies became nothing but whimpers as he clung onto his shirt. It's okay, Shinso. He felt him move his arms. Ojiro thought he was trying to break the hug, but rather he lifted his arms and wrapped them around his neck. Each touch was igniting his nerves. It felt right holding him in his arms and he never wanted to let go. Kaminari, who was keeping watch previously, walked up behind Shinso, wrapping his arm around his waist, keeping him grounded and steady. He nuzzled his head into his shoulder, smiling when he sighed as Shinso tensed up. The buzzing feeling flowing steadily through him like a current. He felt this before when he had impulsively grabbed Ojiro's tail on the first day of school. Sorry about the mess, he snorted, pulling back slightly. Though Kaminari kept his grip around his waist, Ojiro pulled back slightly, a smile resting on his face. As he was still following his heart, he leaned down and pressed a kiss to his forehead. W's dash? Shinso was confused, and yet his heart finally figured out what it yearned for, them. Well, dash. Ojiro looked over at Kaminari, who was practically falling asleep as he was so relaxed around both of his soulmates. You're our soulmate, our third, he muttered, burying his head into Shinso's neck once again. I what? He asked. He had two marks other than his own, both happy and together, while his mark sat dormant on his body. I'm guessing you have a purple cat? Kaminari asked sleepily. Shinso's eyes widened in shock, then he nodded questionably. A mouse and a lion? He asked cautiously. Kaminari said something, but it sounded more like sleepy gibberish than words. You're my soulmates? Ojiro nodded, watching as a smile grew on his face slowly. I have soulmates that want me? We would love to have you, only if you want to dash. Shinso leaned forward and pressed a small and yet quick kiss to his cheek. Yeah, his gaze fell to the ground. I always wanted to meet my soulmates, but I didn't think they would want me because of my quirk. Of course we want you, we didn't think we had another. I think your mark was just as shy as you are. Ojiro was feeling particularly bold for some reason. He was typically shy and yet he was speaking with a confidence that he typically lacked. He leaned down slowly, his eyes flickering up to Shinso's, then back down to his lips. Can I dash? Bathroom? It wasn't a suggestion, it was a demand. Kaminari took it as a sign to let go. Shinso was blushing madly as he grabbed both of their hands and walked down the hall. It was the very place he usually hides when he was on the verge of a breakdown, but luckily he didn't make it in time. Hello, he called out. Once he was sure the bathroom was empty, he wasted no time locking the door and stared up at Ojiro. Are you going to follow through? Kaminari? Ojiro mumbled, said teen, leaning against the wall, happily ready to watch. No objections here, he replied, watching as Ojiro cupped Shinso's face and leaned down. The kiss was blazing hot against Shinso's lips. He'd never kissed someone before and was a tad paranoid, it was obvious. Ojiro, on the other hand, clung to him like he was his lifeline. He was inexperienced, but it didn't matter because everything was complete. The bond that felt empty was seemingly sated. Though it was still too early to be able to feel his emotions, this was more than enough. Kaminari had enough watching. After all, Shinso was his soulmate too. My turn, he mumbled, pulling him away from Ojiro, though Shinso had no qualms as he pushed Kaminari up against the wall he was leaning against and kissed him hungrily. Both his hands gripped his waist, keeping him against the wall while Kaminari kept his arms draped loosely around his neck. Ojiro stood behind Shinso, content letting his hands run down his body, slowly driving him mad with every touch. He gasped, breaking the kiss. If we don't stop here, I will claim you both today, and I would rather get to know you first. Fine, Kaminari sighed, looking up at Ojiro, who leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss against his rather abused lips. We stop for now. Lunch then? Shinso asked, with a slight giggle. Kaminari nodded, wiggling free from his grasp and wrapped his arms around him. "Let's get lunch with our new soulmate then," was all that was said as they walked out of the bathroom, fingers locked together, and smiles on their faces. Typically Todoroki and Iida sat with Midoriya, Uraraka, and Tsuyu, but today they were by themselves. Midoriya was out eating lunch with his soulmates, and Uraraka and Tsuyu were recently bonded, so they wanted as much time as they could get alone, leaving the fated pair alone together. Though they didn't mind it, on the contrary actually, there were times where both men wanted nothing more than to be left alone, but alone in the other's presence, of course. "Tenya," Todoroki started, after moments of appreciated silence, "are you okay with the bond?" I know you used to like Midoriya, and even now it seems you hold something for him." Todoroki hasn't looked at Iida yet. He didn't want him to see the hurt evident on his face. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment conversation. He has been thinking and thinking and thinking about this. It's hurt him too much. "It's okay if you want to break the bond. I get it, we are too similar, and Midoriya is Iida had cupped his face gently and pressed a small yet gentle kiss. "Shoto, I haven't been honest with you. Yes, I had something for Midoriya when we first found out we were bonded. I was so scared that I impulsively confessed to him. I wasn't sure if you were going to want me. I wasn't thinking of your wants or needs, and because of that I hurt you, and I never want to hurt you. I get if you want time away from me and the bond, or that " This time it was Todoroki leaning in, pressing a more heated kiss against his lips. "Yes, you hurt me at first, but as I grew to know you, I know that you care much more than people believe. You care about him so much because of how hurt he is, not only that you value friendship and relationships above all else. I know now to expect you getting attached to people easily because it's who you are, Tenya, and I wouldn't want to change that for the world." Todoroki linked their fingers together with one hand while the other rested against the base of his neck gently. He mumbled, leaning their heads together gently. "Shoto, I love you. I love you too." Todoroki mumbled in response, gently closing the gap with a tender kiss. One just barely brushed the other's lips. Both pulled back, only to see the hungry gaze the other held. They closed the gap once more, this time with a pang of hunger neither has possessed before. Todoroki took it upon himself to crawl into Iida's lap, his legs folding up slightly behind him. One hand was tangled in his hair, the other gripping at his blazer. Iida chuckled in between kisses. He loved how clingy Todoroki could get, how he knew where to place his hands, and it drove him crazy. He stuttered out. Now that Todoroki had moved away from his lips, he had thought they were done. Rather, Todoroki had unbuttoned just a few buttons to his blazer, pressing delicate kisses to his neck, then biting and skinning the base of his neck. Iida was a mess. Ever part of him wanted to claim the bicolored teen at this very moment, but they couldn't. They were at school. And yet he didn't want this to stop. He wanted Todoroki to eat him up, to take what belonged to him. His mind was a mess, trying to decide if he wanted Todoroki to claim him either right there or later that night. Todoroki seemed to notice his inner turmoil and pulled away, pressing a few more kisses to the spot he had marked up. "Tenya," he started, his head buried in the crook of his neck. "What if you claimed me tonight?" "What?" he asked, trying to catch his breath. "I've been thinking about it and I want you to claim me." Todoroki lifted his head, pulling away slightly only to look into Iida's eyes with determination. "You have been there for me when no one else has. Midoriya may have told me to use my quirk, but it was you that helped me use it. You gave me back my life, Tenya, and I don't think I could ever repay." Iida cupped his head gently, pressing an even gentler kiss to his lips. "You don't need to repay me, nor thank me, just stay by my side, Shoto." Todoroki pulled away in shock. "So does that mean my parents are still out of town, being with my brother in the Hosa hospital, which means we have the house to ourselves?" Iida grabbed a fistful of his shirt and dragged him down again, bringing his head only inches away from his. "So I will take what's mine. As you wish." Notes. If y'all are interested, I will be more than happy writing a one-shot of Todoroki and Iida completing the bond. Also, to clarify, here are reasons why the bonds, including the new one, have their roles. Todoroki, definition of daddy issues, has never felt freedom before, and people who gain too much freedom at once tend to get stressed out about it. The bottom of the relationship. Iida, Always had all the freedom he wanted but would rather stay on a strict path. He wants to help Todoroki get used to his new freedoms but doesn't want him upset, so he will sometimes take the lead. I am aware that follows in the path of a dom, but he is kinda vanilla, so would have no clue what a dom is. Obviously the top. Kaminari, SW. The little fucker can't make his mind up at all when it comes to anything, but he will happily be fed senseless by Ojiro. Ojiro, always afraid he will hurt Kaminari in some way. He's very gentle and sometimes that annoys Kaminari, other times he finds it very endearing. The top of it all. Shinso, now this boy has, like you just read, many self-esteem issues. He would have no issue being a top and FNG his boyfriend senseless, but he is afraid that somehow he will hurt them, so he would be at the very bottom, for now at least. I guess it's safer to call him SWH, but eventually he will top Kaminari and in some cases Ojiro. Now here is today's sneak preview. Stain, Midoriya called with a smile. The former villain had been moved to a high-security prison where he would still receive medical treatment. How many times have I told you to call me Akaguro kid? Chapter 64. Summary. I am so sorry I haven't been active on here. I haven't been writing anymore in the BNHA fandom. I sadly fell out of love with it. Just like any fandom or ship, you can easily fall out, and that's what happened here, and I am sad to say that this FIC will be ending in less than a week. I plan on finishing this arc, which marks the end of season. I will leave it kinda open in case I do come back to this fandom and I can start a new FIC right up at the beginning of season 3 and lead into season 4 and possibly 5 if I come back while season 5 is airing. For now, here is this unpublished smut between Todoroki and Iida that I am assuming a lot of people wanted to read. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Iida and Todoroki took the bus to Iida's house that day, both excited to finally fulfill the bond that's kept them on their toes for months now. Hello, Iida called when he entered, just to make sure there was no one home. As he kicked his shoes off, he noticed the note that was sitting on the table by the entrance. Your mother and I went back to Hosu and plan to stay there until next Friday as your brother is getting another surgery for his legs. Love you, Mom and Dad. Tenya, we don't have to do this. If you'd already Tenya dropped the note in his bag and pressed Todoroki up against the wall, a hungry gaze cast towards his soulmate. If I'm honest, I've wanted to do this a few weeks after you accepted the bond. This isn't the first surgery my brother has had, and if it were life or death, you and I would be on a train to Hosu. He lowered his hands, setting them on Todoroki's hips, then pulled them forward, grinding on him. I apologize for being so bold, but it was you who suggested this, so I hope you don't mind when I ask if I can take what's mine. Todoroki has lived a sheltered life, so his first real joy and happiness came from his friends, from his lover, but he's never felt this before. He's never felt such heat and hunger in his body before, and yet he knew only one person could sate this, and it was the same person keeping his hips ground against his. What are you waiting for? Was his only response as Iida smiled slightly, then pressed his lips against his clumsily, as neither cared about the gentle kisses they typically shared but rather the ever-growing heat and hunger between them. Todoroki shifted his arms that had rested on his lover's waist to now wrap around his neck, pulling him down and keeping his body pressed against the wall. Iida growled slightly at this move, as he wanted to be the one in control but was happy Todoroki wanted to show some demps for himself, especially after the life he was raised in. He continued to keep his hands planted on Todoroki's hips, loving the small hitches in his breath every time he moved. Every little touch on his hips made his soulmate flustered and hungry. Iida couldn't ask for anything more. Tenya, he breathed, breaking the kiss. Bedroom? Iida didn't have to be told twice. In one movement he picked his soulmate up, his hands under his thighs holding a bit tighter than usual. He carried him up the stairs, loving how his body pressed against his easily, perfectly even. When we get to your room, what will you do to me? Todoroki asked, his voice feigning innocence. Iida pressed a kiss on his lips, trailing down to his neck where he pressed heavier ones. Anything you want, I'm not the only person here, Shoto, he mumbled into his neck. Todoroki smiled to himself, loving the attention and consent his soulmate was essentially asking him for. And if I asked you to claim me with all the strength you have? Iida groaned, stopping at his bedroom door, then turning the handle with his hand, still keeping. Todoroki pressed against his growing erection. I would ask if you knew how strong I was, The minute he opened the door, Todoroki squirmed out of his arms and onto the bed, sitting there with a smile. He covered the lower half of his body with a pillow as he slowly undid his undershirt from school. "Tenya, come take what's yours." The boy didn't have to be told twice. He undid the first few buttons but decided against it and stalked towards the bed. "Tell me if I become too much for you to handle, Shoto," he whispered, pressing a kiss against his lips while his hand cupped his cheek. Todoroki took it upon himself to unbutton his shirt, his fingers trailing along his lover's bare skin as he did so. "You tease," he whispered, his words being muffled as he spoke against Todoroki's lips. The hushed whispers make this all RDC. "Touch me." The statement was more of a question, but Iida found it endearing. With a nod he lowered his head, pressing kisses against his chest. "I wonder." He leaned towards the left, pressing a kiss on his NPL, then flicking it with his tongue. When he heard the shaky that left his lover's lips, he was happy with the little thought he had. This time he clamped his mouth over it, his teeth gently pulling and grazing the sensitive bud. "Tenya," he ummed, his hands reaching his lover's hair. What are you doing?" "An experiment," he replied, letting his other hand fall on his over chest, rubbing the other NPL between his fingers. A shock of pleasure tore through Todoroki, making his Erkton painfully hard at this point. His gasps and ums were a treat for Iida to hear. He lifted his head to look at the blushing mess that was his soulmate, then pressed gentle kisses to the skin he had abused. Todoroki's breath hitched when Iida's head stopped by his Erkton. A small and yet devious smirk pulled at his lips when he pressed a kiss to it through his slacks. "Peepa please," Todoroki ummed as Iida gripped his deech through his jeans. The added pressure was driving him insane. "Please what?" Iida asked. He too was painfully hard and longed to eft his soulmate senseless but would settle for the teasing that came first. "Please touch me," he begged, tears pricking his eyes. It was almost too much for him. Iida noticed this, leaned forward, and pressed a gentle kiss against his lips. All right, he was unsure if this was hurting his soulmate, having gotten this far with his rampant imagination that he had kept at bay for a few months now. But he didn't always ignore it. Alone, however, was usually when he let his mind free. And the looks and small gasps of air his soulmate was making weren't comparable to his imagination in the slightest. Slowly he undid his slacks, pulling them down and onto the floor, as it would be hard to explain the mysterious stains on his breathes to his father or anyone for that matter. He pressed his lips against his still-clothed D-dash, loving how Todoroki whimpered and muttered small pleas to touch him. He felt him pull his underwear down, the cold air making him gasp slightly until the gasp turned into a large, unfiltered Todoroki threw his head back. The small kisses he placed on and around his deech were driving him insane until he dragged his tongue along the top and once again he ummed loudly. "Tenya," he begged once more. This time he didn't respond, rather he dragged his tongue from the base to the top, then let his mouth fall down on his Erkton, taking as much as he could. Iida would be lying if he said he didn't enjoy teasing him, that he didn't enjoy watching him squirm under his touch. The sounds his soulmate made were better than any song he'd ever listened to. The gasps of air as Iida forced Todoroki's bucking hips back onto the bed made it better. Tenya I-dashed. He wanted to hear the uhs and shouts of pleasure from his soulmate, so he continued, dragging his teeth, letting his tongue at times flick across the top, driving his soulmate up the wall until, "Tenya!" he called out, coming into his soulmate's mouth. Rather than spitting out the fluid, he swallowed it all, the bitter taste slowly fading and his soulmate's breathes all that was heard. "My turn," he growled. The lack of attention on his deed made it almost unbearably painful, and he didn't want Todoroki to SK him off. What the dash? Todoroki didn't know what was going to happen as his soulmate grabbed his hips and forced him to turn around, keeping his hips in the air. Oh. He felt something warm and wet touch his a-hole, and it wasn't something he didn't like, rather he wasn't used to. He whined when the contact from his soulmate disappeared, then shuddered as something cold and wet was replaced. "Tell me if I hurt you," was all Iida said. He was going to question why when something slid inside of him, small but it was new. When he didn't say anything, Iida added another finger. Todoroki felt slight pain, but the pleasure that was slowly building again made it tolerable until it disappeared, and the feeling of something inside him was once again making him hard. When Iida put his third finger in, he smiled to himself as Todoroki ummed quietly, breathing slightly. Deeming 3 was enough, he rubbed lube over his PP. This was a time of pleasure and pain could wait, until later that is. Tenya, Todoroki hissed as he felt something much larger push its way inside of him. Am I hurt? More please, he gritted out, trying to push his hips back onto his D, but Iida stopped him. Iida bit back the large of pleasure that tore through him as he slowly inched his way further inside his soulmate until his ball were touching his butt. Can I move? He asked. Todoroki shifted a bit then nodded. Iida pulled back then slowly moved forward. As he slowly moved faster and faster, Todoroki was once again painfully hard. His breaths and dungs turned into whines of pleasure and pain. He reached down and started to touch himself, though Iida had other plans. He leaned forward, his hips moving slightly now, and harshly grabbed his D-, moving his hand in time to the rhythm he found. Tenya harder, please, Todoroki ummed, trying to lift his hips higher. Don't tell me I didn't warn you, he gritted out as he let go of his D and grabbed his lover's hips, and pulled them forward. A loud slap was heard then another and another. The previous rhythm didn't compare to the slight pain Todoroki was feeling that made it even more pleasurable. Alright there, pee-pee please Tenya. Todoroki whined, his hands clutching the sheets. Once again his soulmate plowed into the same spot, making him loudly. Shoto I'm close, Iida groaned, looking down at his mess of a soulmate. Should I ? Please come in my butt, was the lewdest thing Iida had ever heard Todoroki say, and he was happy to do what he asked. Leaning down he grabbed his D-, once again pumping it every time his D disappeared into his lover. Tenya. Todoroki ummed loudly and he cummed once more into his hand. Iida ignored the cum and pressed his back against Todoroki's, his hands planted on either side of him as he ground his D into his butt. Shoto, he choked out, leaning down to bite the base of his neck. His hips ground into Todoroki's but he came inside him. He gave a few weak moves before pulling out, falling onto the bed next to him. Todoroki giggled, his chest fluttery with the newfound emotions in their shared bond. I love you Tenya, he whispered. Iida, who didn't care how messy they were, pressed a kiss to his lips then smiled widely. I love you too Shoto. Notes. I'm actually sad to let this FIC go. This is the first time in forever I had enjoyed writing something and I hadn't stopped at chapter 10. I kept so many chapters banked and I posted almost every day at first and everyone loved the FIC and some worried for my sanity seeing as how each chapter can range between 3k to 10k words depending on the scene. I have 5 to 6 chapters left. This isn't my final goodbye. I will save that bittersweet moment for the final chapter of this FIC, but for now here is your sneak peek into tomorrow's chapter. Stain, Midoriya called with a smile. The former villain had been moved to a high-security prison where he would still receive medical treatment. How many times have I told you to call me Akaguro kid? Yes, I am aware this is the same one I used in the previous chapter, but I didn't expect people wanting it to do eat a smut or I would have hinted towards that XD. Chapter 65. Summary. Guys, I'm not leaving until I finish this FIC. I will post one last chapter after I finish the FIC in a way to explain why I'm truly leaving and what will be happening with my FIC as well as other uncompleted ones. For now, enjoy the final moments I have with this FIC and I hope you will all enjoy what I have left to say. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. The day finally came, the day of the practical exams, and for a certain green-haired teen, he was ecstatic. Wake up sleepyheads, today's exam day, he called, walking through the open door loudly. Midoriya crawled onto the bed, though it was more like a shuffle as he had 2 cups of coffee made the way they both liked it, in each hand. Exams, Yamada groaned, trying to turn over but the smell of coffee coaxed him enough to sit up and drink some. Aizawa had sat up slowly, not saying anything but rather pressing a kiss to Midoriya's cheek and taking the coffee. So you must be wondering why I'm in such a good mood? He asked, scurrying towards the desk in the corner and grabbing the binder that had each teacher's assigned goals for the students and the students they were assigned to. We figured it was because of the exams. You get to fight someone, Aizawa grumbled, taking a rather large sip of coffee. Well, it's who I'm fighting that I'm excited about. He flipped the pages until he stopped at the one before. Setting the binder down, he dramatically flipped it and smiled. I'm paired up with Bakugo against All Might. That about stopped his soulmate's hearts. Yamada had choked on his coffee while Aizawa practically spat up any that was in his mouth. You what? Both asked, looking down at the page in shock. Yamada leaned in further to see but was still in shock regardless. I get to beat him up. When will I ever get a chance to prove that being quirkless doesn't mean it's a hindrance to him again? He asked. Both his soulmates went silent. I know you don't like it, he's the #1 hero for a reason, but I need to do this. Not only do I need to pass the test to stay in the hero course, but I also need him to come to terms with the fact that you don't need a quirk to be a hero. You can't get out of the test now, sadly. Aizawa pinched the bridge of his nose, taking another sip of coffee then sighing. Just be careful, since you have All Might you are scheduled to go last, it gives you enough time to get prepadash. He stopped talking when Midoriya pulled out book number 13. It was burned and water damaged, but most of the information was readables, some even new. After he told me I couldn't be a hero without a quirk, I may have gotten very angry and essentially figured out his every weakness. But then I realized every weakness is leading to one big secret I have yet to figure out. To really scare him, all I have to do is pretend like I know what it is. He said simply. His soulmates were in shock about how much information he could get on the man alone. Once again, Izuku, you both astound and terrify me, Yamada said with a smile, making Midoriya giggle and press a kiss to his cheek. You have about 15 minutes until we have to leave. I woke you both up, so it's time for you to get ready as fast as possible. That's your test for today. And like that, his soulmate scurried out of bed and started getting ready for the day they had ahead of them. Midoriya had taken the bus with his other classmates who were bustling about, excited and nervous for their tests. So are we fighting each other? Kaminari asked. Midoriya smiled and shook his head. Now that it was the day of the test and the teachers had the information on who they were up against, he thought it was fair they knew some things. Not exactly, I will say fighting each other will be a hindrance, he replied, his hand fiddling with Todoroki's, his fingers tapping against the other's hand. He was sitting next to them, as Todoroki opted to sit in Iida's lap, who complained about the safety at first then slowly gave in to the demand. Will we be fighting against other pairs? Kirishima asked. Midoriya shook his head with a slight giggle. No, though you are fighting someone, he replied. Todoroki seemed to have an idea as he had stiffened up and looked at Midoriya, his brows furrowed. You didn't dash. I did, he answered. Iida was a tad confused but still loved the moment they held. How come Todoroki knows about it? Mina chirped, looking over at the shocked teen then at Midoriya, who looked too pleased with himself. He didn't know, not until now, he replied, watching as Todoroki shook his head then relaxing against Iida, who kept his arms wrapped around Todoroki's waist. Here, the bus driver called. The students got off quickly, excited to finally see what would happen, only to be stopped by a group of teachers. Midoriya bound up to Aizawa and Yamada, grabbing both their hands with a smile. Welcome to the practical exam, Aizawa started. Midoriya giggled to himself as his soulmate spoke. Of course it's possible to fail the exam. If you want to go to the training camp this summer, don't make stupid mistakes. There are a lot of teachers here, Jiro muttered. It still hadn't dawned on a majority of the students that their practical exam involved the teachers. I take it you tried to gather information for this exam? Aizawa asked. Midoriya giggled to himself, leaning against Aizawa, thought it was Yamada who had leaned forward and draped his arms over Midoriya's shoulders, content on holding him. Kaminari was ready to explain his findings after asking around, but the giggle he heard from Midoriya made him uneasy. He knew he giggled only for two reasons. He was either happy or something horribly wrong will happen. And in this case, his gut was telling him it was the latter. Typically the exams are robots from the first exam against the students, but after the villain attacks on your class we decided to change it up from now on, Nedzu exclaimed, jumping up from Aizawa's scarf. Midoriya almost lost it. He was trying his best not to laugh so loudly. He knew Nedzu loved tapping into his animalistic side at times, and like a rodent, he preferred warm, enclosed areas. Midoriya had suggested hiding in Aizawa's scarf, as it always sat on his neck and it seemed to be pretty dark. He had no idea how dark it would be, but only that it could be. Nedzu loved the idea, though Midoriya didn't think he would ever go through with it, until today. So now, Nedzu slid down his scarf with ease then smiled. You will be fighting against the teachers. We had originally given thought to you choosing your own pairs, but after someone spoke up, we decided against it. This is where I come in. Midoriya had collected himself to speak. He produced a binder from the backpack he wore, as he was the only one in the class who had brought his bag for this reason. I am aware my observational ability scares the majority of you, and I doubt this explanation would make it any better. I know your every strength and weakness, what you have trouble with, and what you excel with, quirk-wise that is. He noted that some of his classmates stiffened up, hating the fact that he knew this stuff, but he continued. So instead of letting you guys choose your pairs, I chose them for you because a test shouldn't be designed to just pass or fail you but rather teach you more and assess what you know. I assigned everyone a partner and a given time slot with a teacher in different areas of the school, that way we can all watch the others' tests and learn. He opened the binder and smiled, starting to rattle off the names and teachers who would be paired with each. Ojiro and Koda versus Yamada, he called, feeling his soulmate tense up, then noticed the confused looks on Koda and Jiro's faces. Koda? Will they be okay with that much sound? Ojiro asked. Midoriya smiled to himself and continued. He reached the final pair, then looked towards All Might with a large smile. He had kept him out of the loop on who his other student would be for obvious reasons. Me and Bakugo versus All Might? He smiled widely. As the teacher froze in shock, the other staff could see the visible confusion and slight fear when the boy spoke. After all, he learned from the best. Stain, Midoriya called with a smile. The former villain had been moved to a high-security prison where he would still receive medical treatment. How many times have I told you to call me Akaguro kid? He asked, the slight annoyance in his voice feigned only to make him smile. Midoriya rolled his eyes, taking a seat in front of the rather thick glass. Unlike other inmates, Akaguro wasn't able to leave for visitation. He was able to meet people but from the safety of his prison cell. Every time I come here, but this time I bring stories and revenge, he giggled. Akaguro shook his head, his limp hair now messy and even more untamed since his days as the hero killer. About who? He asked, sitting up slightly. All Might, Midoriya replied. Akaguro almost fell out of his bed. He was so curious and yet confused. You met him? He asked. Midoriya nodded and started to tell his story once again, watching as his face scrunched up in anger as if he was ready to wield his blades again for his sake. He's the #1 hero and yet the former villain shook his head, practically spitting the words, #1 hero. I have thought of revenge, not the killing type of it, of course. He looked up at the cameras that were definitely watching him at this point. Do tell, he hummed, making Midoriya giggle. Every year the UA Heroics department has a practical exam. This year it's against the teachers, and it just so happens Nedzu trusts me enough to plan the pairs and teachers. You didn't I set up an exam for me and Bakugo against All Might, and the best part is, my soulmates have yet to find out. He giggled to himself. Akaguro started to laugh, though it turned into coughs instead. I also learned from you, Midoriya smiled, making Akaguro question what else he has taught this kid and if it could get him into legal trouble. How to scare people with a smile. You once again Akaguro was laughing to himself, shaking his head. Kid, I think visitation time is about up, but you need to come back next week and tell me what happens. I will. See you soon, Aki, he called, watching as Akaguro froze then shook his head, a rather large smile settling on his face. Even the guards who sat and watched him every day had a soft spot for the boy, as they could see how much he means to the former villain. See you later, Midori. You have 30 minutes to pass the test by putting these HNDCFFS on the teacher, or one of you escapes the arena before time runs out. Nedzu called as Midoriya handed each team a pair. It will be way different than the entrance exam. You will be up against some way better than you. Yamada called. Midoriya sent him a glare but continued to face his classmates. Someone better than us? I can't really imagine it. Hey, watch your mouth, girl. Yamada called in annoyance, though Midoriya laughed, giving her a thumbs up. This time your exam will feature a battle like the one you've had against villains. Please treat us teachers as villains. 13 called, though no one could ever treat them as a villain, they were too nice. Assuming you come across the enemy, if you think you can win a fight against M, then fight. However, Snipe was cut off by Aizawa, who was staring at Bakugo, then Midoriya. If the gap between the hero and the villain is too big, It would be smart to run away and get help. He looked away then at Todoroki and Iida. Todoroki, Iida, Midoriya, I'm sure you three understand this well. Todoroki and Iida felt the other's inner turmoil, the memories of the night in the back alley in Hosu almost too vivid to suppress. Midoriya, on the other hand, smiled slightly to himself, the memories at times bitter, but with the help of the villain that attacked them, he is able to understand the world of villains and heroes much more than the media heroes produce about villains. That's why we had these made, ultra-compressed compression weights. All Might called, snapping the bands on. The students watched as the other teachers showed off the weights, some even putting them on now. With these our stamina will be eaten up much faster, giving you a handicap against us. Kirishima and Sato, you are up first. The rest of you, I advise you to come up with a plan against your assigned teacher in the watch room, Aizawa called, walking inside with the rest of the teachers. Midoriya faced Bakugo, but he only brushed by him, annoyed that he was fighting All Might with a handicap. Watch now, talk later, I guess, Midoriya grumbled, catching up with his soulmates and walking inside to observe the pairings. Notes: this is the beginning of the end of this arc, where we finally will see Midoriya and Bakugo vs. All Might, and it hurts to post this because I know it's coming to an end soon. Here is your sneak peek into tomorrow's chapter. As his platonic soulmates, we have to support him, and since his soulmates can't always be there for him hero work-wise, it's our job to keep him safe. Todoroki lifted his hand and placed it against his cheek. Iida nuzzled his hand, placing his over Todoroki's, then a small, feather-light kiss to his palm. Chapter 66. Summary. Since yesterday was Thanksgiving, I will post 2 chapters today, seeing as how I couldn't post yesterday. As time went on, some of the classmates had already started to get antsy. Though they had a set, or at least somewhat set, plan of attack, they still needed someone to bounce the idea off of, and thought their classmates were a good idea. There is someone they had to talk to, and he was the very one that planned their pairs, and that very someone was leaning against the wall, annoyed that Bakugo wouldn't talk to him, even though he had agreed to work on it not even a few days ago. The other pairs had opted to go to their own rooms to talk and strategize, but without Midoriya, they felt a tad hopeless. Is this what it's like to have a sidekick? No, he's more than a sidekick. Iida shook his head, ashamed he thought of him like that, even for a moment. Are you thinking about asking Midoriya for help? Todoroki was about to take his test, though Iida would be following right after, so neither would be able to watch the other properly. Iida nodded, his gaze cast towards the floor. For a moment there I thought of him as a sidekick, but he's so much better than that title, he sighed, reaching out for Todoroki's hand. Their fingers threaded together, Todoroki leaning his head against Iida's arm for a moment, deeming the armor his lover wore to be too uncomfortable. Being a sidekick is the safest option for him, but being a hero is what he really wants to do, and as his official platonic soulmates neither could stop the large smiles that tugged at their lips when they heard the title. It's not as if there was anything, document-wise, they had to do, but rather talking to the soulmates or soulmates in Midoriya's case, as well as any family, though all parties involved knew about Midoriya's home life, so his mom was kept out of the loop. They had a proper talk with each other only a few days ago, talking about Midoriya and his needs, as if the poor boy wasn't sitting next to them, curling into himself due to the embarrassment. As his platonic soulmates, we have to support him, and since his soulmates can't always be there for him hero work-wise, it's our job to keep him safe. Todoroki lifted his hand and placed it against his cheek. Iida nuzzled his hand, placing his over Todoroki's, then a small, feather-light kiss to his palm. I like that, he mumbled, embarrassed at how bold his soulmate was. I like to know that we will be there for him when his soulmates won't be. Is that wrong of me? He asked, his eyes meeting Todoroki's, then turning back to the floor with a small blush dusting his cheeks. I would be a hypocrite if I said yes, he replied, leaning up to press a kiss to his lips when the speaker system blared. Todoroki Shoto to testing room 1. The rooms were all different from the other, they weren't even rooms but different testing grounds that would be revealed on site. I will be waiting, Iida mumbled, stealing a quick kiss before Todoroki walked away, carrying newfound confidence. Grabbing his helmet off the table, he walked out, looking for his platonic third in the viewing room to ask questions. Before he said anything, Midoriya smiled, pointing to the first screen on the left. I figured you were with him. He grabbed his hand, as no one wanted to cuddle a suit of armor. Iida happily intertwined their fingers, watching as Todoroki and Yamamo walked and talked, waiting for their teacher to show up. Who are they fighting? Iida whispered. Midoriya smiled to himself as his soulmate jumped out, his scarves flying towards Todoroki and Yamamo. Shoyuda, he replied. Iida rolled his eyes at his best friend's antics and watched as they ran, trying to figure out the next plan of attack. Midoriya looked up at Iida. The smile he wore was one that he was familiar with. It was the same gentle smile his soulmates wore. They're good for each other, he thought, looking back at the screen with a smile. I just hope nothing. He stopped the train of thought. With his luck, simple thoughts and accidental jinxes come to fruition, and it's usually his doing. With a small sigh, he watched the battle he had set up unfold in front of him, rooting for everyone involved. This exam depends on who sees who first, Todoroki started, peeling his back off the wall in the alley, then peered around the corner. Their teacher was perched on top of a lamppost, looking around for his students. Once I get his attention, run to the gate, you should be able to escape. They hadn't talked before the test, neither thinking they needed it, but Yamamo was already starting to regret the idea. She frowned, sighing as she moved away from the wall, only to see the slightly annoyed expression on Todoroki's face. What's wrong? Hurry up and make something, he muttered, oblivious to her distress and the words clawing at her throat, trying to spill. Right, okay, she shook her head, the realization that maybe it was for the best Todoroki had taken the lead. After all, she wasn't one to make decisions, and after events like USJ or even the sports festival, she didn't trust herself to make the same mistakes. They took off running, keeping their eyes on the skyline, occasionally looking back for their teacher. It was one of the times Todoroki looked back that he questioned what she was doing. I know I said to make something, but what are those? She blushed, keeping her face straight as she buried her emotions. For 1 second she will listen and get out of this without messing up. Russian nesting dolls, she replied as they stopped. She shoved them into her belt, trying to keep at least a few on her. Okay, he responded, looking down at his lightly frosted hand. Let me know if you notice anything strange with your quirk. Keeping their quirks running like this was a sure sign their teacher was there, or at the very least in his line of sight. She sighed, then took off running, only a few feet behind Todoroki. She won't mess this up, she can't afford to. What are you doing? Iida muttered, his grip on Midoriya's hand now tight and yet hasn't realized it. I don't think Todoroki is used to working with people he isn't comfortable with yet, Midoriya offered. It was one of the reasons why he teamed Yamamo and Todoroki up. Both had a major underlying issue that needed someone close to them to help solve. What better than their homeroom teacher, someone that's been with them through it all at UA, to help? What do you mean? Iida asked. He hadn't noticed it before, but then again, he doesn't notice half the stuff Midoriya does. He knew to come running when I texted him the location, but we are close, we are platonically bonded now. He smiled to himself when he said that but continued to talk. But he tends to hang around your or me, sometimes Uraraka and Sayu, but it's always us. Now that he is becoming a hero, he needs to realize that he has to work with people he doesn't typically work with, who better than Yamamo, both received a recommendation for the hero course after all. You are amazing, Iida responded simply. He pressed a quick kiss against his temple. It was the most either of them was allowed to do as platonic soulmates. Keep watching your soulmate, Midoriya responded with a slight laugh. Iida sighed and looked up, watching with a newfound confusion as his soulmate took the lead against their teacher. Todoroki, Yamamo finally spoke up. Thank you for taking the lead. You were able to come up with a plan to use against Aizawa-sensei so quickly. I doubt I would be able to do something like that. She smiled, trying to reassure herself, but it was failing, and quickly. It's nothing special, he responded in a dull voice, keeping his eyes to the skyline. Nothing especially? She mumbled as she stopped running. Todoroki stopped and looked back at her with an annoyed look. As students who got into UA through recommendations, we started from the same place. But in terms of the practical skills a hero needs, I haven't done anything that stands out. During the cavalry battle, I just did as you said. In my own fight, I lost before I could do anything against Tokoyami. She looked away, ashamed in herself, but it was Todoroki who spoke next. Yairozu, your doll's dash. He looked down at his hand and noticed the frost was gone. He's coming. I'm so sorry. She shouted in response. Meanwhile, Aizawa was frustrated with the situation, not meaning to take it out on his students, but after hearing her frustrations, he couldn't go easy on them. If you realize that, then you should immediately start acting. He shouted from above them. He easily dodged the attack Todoroki tried to start, but with his quirk erased he simply spun around. In this case, you should prioritize evasion, since I got ahead of you. Yaoyorozu, go! He shouted, starting to fight his teacher, though it was more hand-to-hand combat so long he had his quirk on. She turned and started to run the other way, tears pricking her eyes at the internal frustration but never let them fall. Is that what the plan was? Aizawa asked, unfurling his scarf. He easily tied Todoroki up and hung him from the electrical wires. Then this is perfect either way, I'd been planning to catch you first since you're the offense. He let his quirk turn off, then focused on tying the scarf piece to the pole. You think you can restrain me? I can burn or freeze these restraints instantly. Todoroki fought back. He could feel the temperature drop on his right side and the left heating up, not enough to show but just enough to start whittling away at the restraints. I don't care what you do, just because where you fall. Aizawa threw out a handful of sharp objects, a frown settling on his face. Caltrops? Todoroki grumbled, looking down at the rather dangerous weapons that littered the ground like stones. Why are you coming up with such an unpleasant measure? This is different from the time with the hero killer. He fished out the bottle of eye drops he kept in his bag. I know how many heroes there are and how many quirks. I am perfectly prepared to intercept you at any moment. Your plan places the burden pretty heavily on yourself. It's nice to try and be considerate towards the girl, but maybe you should have talked it over more. He sighed, the disappointment heavy in his mind, but it was times like these that proved if a student was truly capable of being a hero. You're bonded to Izuku, platonically anyway. I would have thought you would consult him beforehand. I doubt he would give you any information though. He wants to keep the playing field even, but he also wants us to help the students. Aizawa explained, keeping his eyes on the ground, trying to find his other student. Help us? Midori, what are you planning? Todoroki thought, trying his best not to fall on the caltrops even if he got out of the bonds. We have a slight advantage over any of the students, Aizawa continued, walking around the trap easily, but you have the greater advantage. With that, Aizawa ran off, looking for Yamamoto. What's the advantage? Midori? Iida muttered and looked towards the boy who was grinning from ear to ear. You all have an advantage, one greater than the teacher and their handicap, but you have to think about it. For example, the previous fight was ectoplasm versus Tokoyami and Tsu. The students won, but there was a slight error with the teacher. He can fight, but it's almost self-sacrificing. Ectoplasm had the ability to make 30 clones of himself or one large one. Because of this, he's grown reliant on fighting tooth and nail without expecting damage. He had Tsu pinned and Tokoyami occupied, so he thought he won. But when Tsu used a part of her quirk she doesn't like using, he was taken off guard. He rambled, his eyes focused on the fight. Iida stared in disbelief at his explanation. He was ready to fight again like that when he got cuffed. His style of fighting and Tsaya's quirk allowed them to pass, as no one was expecting it. He smiled to himself. Iida only rolled his eyes, a tad jealous of his brain of course. He would plan for all of this. So sensei then, Iida's voice trailed off. Midoriya smiled and looked over at him. Keep watching. Iida sighed but continued to watch the screen nonetheless. Impressed once again by Midoriya's thought process. Chapter 67. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Yamamoto was running faster than she ever has before, her eyes darting widely around the area, and he couldn't catch her or the plan would fail. And it would be all her fault. How much farther until the escape gate? Is there a shorter route I missed? Is Todoroki all right? Is this okay? Where am I running? I can't do this. Tears began to bubble forth and threatened to fall, her thoughts now a poison to her own mind. She couldn't think clearly anymore. She stopped running, her breathing staggering as she looked ahead then back. What am I doing? She whispered to herself. Her quirk long stopped working, but it was as if it didn't matter anymore. Suddenly the familiar sound of scarves sliding against something reached her ears, and before she knew it she turned around, Aizawa closing in on her quickly, his quirk inactive. I can see why Izuku paired them up with me as their opponent. It's obvious Todoroki would lead with the confidence he's always had, but after the sports festival Yaoyorozu had lost hers. Aizawa thought as his scarf launched towards Yamamoto, who dodged and continued to run forward. If he's here, does that mean Todoroki's dash? Suddenly his scarf latched onto her arm. He skidded to a stop on top of a nearby roof, then started to pull the scarf back, careful not to hurt her. I'm going to hit you where it hurts, he called like a villain and started to wind up his scarf faster. Yamamoto let her head fall in shame, defeat settling across her body. I wonder what my parents would say when their daughter has failed her exams? She thought bitterly, unable to look up at him. My quirk isn't erased? She's figured out Sho's weakness, Midoriya giggled to himself, watching the screen with a large smile. Midori, what happened? Iida asked, confused. Sho, for as cold and calculated as he can be, has a soft heart, one I haven't seen in anyone else, so much so that it's his weakness. He was so focused on not only keeping her from getting hurt but also trying to give her time to think that he forgot to keep her quirk turned off. Simple mistake. But it was big enough to give her time. He sighed, happy that she figured it out. I don't think she's realized that yet, Midori, Iida replied, a soft smile resting on his face as he watched Midoriya, who was analyzing the screen intently, the smile still present. Not yet, but she will, I know she will. Going in the opposite direction? He thought, a bit shocked and angry at himself for slipping up so easily, and yet a tad happy he did. She's left all the decision-making to him. Comparing herself to Todoroki, she's decided he's better than her. Watching someone like Todoroki who doesn't hesitate or think before running into danger, for better or worse, she's lost confidence in her own ability to plan ahead. Aizawa thought, watching as she ran away quickly, little dolls popping off her skin. I want to help her, but right now that's not my job. Aizawa jumped to the next rooftop, keeping his field of vision open while looking for Todoroki and Yamamoto at the same time. Maybe you should talk it over more, Todoroki muttered, staring down at the caltrips that were slowly becoming the bane of his existence. Now that I think about it, it looked like she wanted to say something. He continued, then stopped talking. How does Midoriya do this all the time? Todoroki! Yamamoto shouted. He turned his head towards the sound of her voice, both feeling relief and dread when he saw her. Yamamoto! He called back, looking around for their teacher. I'm sorry, Aizawa-sensei is coming back. He called, cutting her off. She whipped her head around to see him running across the telephone wires, his head turning to look straight down at her, then back at the wire. What do I do? Do I run or save Todoroki? She thought, her head whipping around to both Todoroki and Aizawa, almost making her dizzy. Yaoyorozu! Todoroki called, snapping her out of her panic. You have a plan, right? I'm sorry, I should have listened earlier. Do you still have a plan? He asked, his anxiety spiking when he noticed how close their teacher was. Yamamoto looked away, contemplating something. Her eyes darted back up to Aizawa. But your plan didn't work. Why do you believe mine will be any better? She asked, without meaning to spit out the words as harshly as they did. It's fine, just tell me. She winced and he sighed to himself, coming out much harsher than he intended. I mean, you're usually suited best for this stuff. I should have listened to you. When we were voting for the class rep, you had 2 votes, right? She looked up with uncertainty, her eyes quickly darting over to look at Aizawa, who was approaching even closer now. One of those votes was mine. Daring, how daring, Aizawa called out from above them. She looked up in shock as he sailed over her, ready to perch on the wire that he had Todoroki tied up on to grab her. She smiled to herself, then grabbed at the Russian nesting dolls in her belt. Todoroki, close your eyes. She threw the dolls up quickly, then ran towards him. Aizawa looked at the dolls for a moment, batting them away when the flash grenade inside went off, triggering others he had swung at on accident. I do have an idea. I have had those ready, but I wasn't sure if you wanted to listen to my idea. She gently lowered him to the ground after clearing the caltrips as quickly as she could. I have a special operation to beat Aizawa-sensei. Special operation? Todoroki asked, watching their teacher smile and rub his eyes. Midoriya already explained this to us. He gave us the biggest advantage out of all the students. She figured it out. He called, his smile wide as tears pricked his eyes. She's okay. he said with less enthusiasm but rather a calmness Iida hasn't seen in a while. Are you okay? He asked, bringing his hand up to his lips, gently pressing a kiss. Small touches like this were allowed in the bond they have. Midoriya looked over and smiled gently, wiping his eyes. She's okay, she figured it out and has taken the lead. My plan worked. He didn't have the complete confidence in himself as the others had in him, but it was moments like this that he cheered and loved being quirkless. He helped someone who needed it without being so involved but rather on the sidelines helping everyone. Midori, keep watching, Iida smiled, their attention brought back to the screen. My time after the USJ arc to use my quirk has decreased, and if she noticed that, his scarf lashed out, the duo easily dodging now. I think you taught them pretty well, Midoriya. Todoroki shot his arm out, trying to get his teacher away by using the fire part of his quirk, yet nothing happened. He's erasing our quirks, he muttered, looking back at Yamamoto quickly. Run, let's hide together. They took off running, their teacher not too far behind on the telephone wires. Todoroki, he has a longer rest period between the time he uses his quirk. Is it because of USJ? He asked, remembering how distraught Midoriya was when he realized his soulmate was losing his quirk and blamed himself for it. So we're going to exploit that? No, for now, we need to get out of his field of vision, she replied, looking back at their teacher once more before rounding a corner. It's only a matter of time, we can win this still. Time get out of his field of vision, can we do it? He asked, looking back at her. Can we actually do it? We can't even use our quirks. Do as I tell you, she bit back, not bothering to look at their teacher anymore. Start trying to see if you can use your ice. I'm gonna catch you, Aizawa called, throwing his scarf, trying to break the distance, as he was better in hand-to-hand and close combat than he was from a distance. Thinking we can't use our quirks is a bad assumption to make, Yamamoto thought, keeping her head forward, waiting for the time her quirk turned back on. There will definitely be a moment, a time where Aizawa-sensei has to blink. There it is. Todoroki thought as a small patch of his hand formed ice. He skids to a stop, turning around suddenly and formed the same giant ice wall he did at the sports festival. They were waiting for this, Aizawa thought, landing back on a rooftop, a smirk playing at his lips. Yes, you have to hit your opponent where it hurts. I think you taught them that as Zuku? Midoriya smiled to himself. The bond was warm and happy, the slightest tinge of sadness, but Aizawa was unmistakably proud of his students. They are almost out of time. Iida spat like it was a curse. Midoriya gripped his hand a tad tighter. They will make it, I'm sure of it. I blocked him with my quirk. For now, we can use our dash. He turned back to look at Yamamoto. He had his head turned for a moment then turned around. Aizawa-sensei's weapon? Yes, she responded, unfazed by how much skin she was showing compared to Todoroki, who only wanted to keep himself turned away for every moment of it. I don't know the details of how it's exactly made or made of, but I made my own with a certain material woven into it. She explained, watching the fabric fall to the ground. Since this is a residential area, we have to keep the damage to a minimum, and he moves quickly, especially in places like this. Those restraining bonds of his make him even harder to catch. You might want to keep your head turned, she called, squatting down and pulling the rest of her costume down to just above her back. Suddenly small pieces of wood started to pop out of her arms, pop and eventually wheels and a catapult arm. As the pieces fell to the ground, some taking more effort to fall than others, she could feel her energy depleting. It was getting harder to keep her mind focused on the chemical structure of each piece. Todoroki, start building please, she called, her voice slightly strained as a wheel tumbled out of her back. He kept his gaze towards the items but started to snap and fit them together. Meanwhile, Aizawa was jumping from rooftop to rooftop, trying to find his students in this seemingly large maze of ice. Where did they go? He muttered, stopping at a higher rooftop. Was it a diversion to continue running away? Izuki, you put me up against both students that had got in through recommendations? He grumbled, looking at the watch on his wrist. 10 minutes left and they are only halfway to the exit. Todoroki, what do you think of my plan? She asked, straightening out her costume as she faced him. I believe this has a higher chance of succeeding than trying to escape Aizawa-sensei. It will all be decided in an instant, is this okay? She asked once more, looking back at him. He nodded then turned away. No complaints here. The escape gate is right behind me. Rather than chasing them out, I will watch for their approach. Aizawa thought, keeping his eyes trained to the ground. Suddenly he saw two clothed figures running away from the gate. He jumped up and pulled his scarf slightly. It's true, if I can't see them I can't erase their quirk. He quickly leapt towards them, pulling the scarf more. But there are more disadvantages than advantages here. The cloth fell to reveal that the top portion were mannequins while they ran hunched over, pulling along the catapult. There is just one thing to do dash. She pushed her hand down only to miss the lever, giving Aizawa a moment to jump back, but she still pushed the lever down once more, firing the scarf. A diversion again? He thought, unsure if he could hit the scarf or not. Todoroki, blast your flames down low, she called. Suddenly, from under the cloth, a jet of fire swarmed and heated the area around them up. Why isn't he aiming for me? He thought, watching, to his own horror, the mock scarf she had made slowly turning brittle around him. We can't be Aizawa-sensei in a battle of quirks at our current level, that's why dash. Aizawa-sensei, have you heard of nitinol alloy? She called, watching as he fell slowly, unable to keep up with the rapid heating and reshaping of the scarf. When heated up, the alloy will return to its original state. It's a shape memory alloy, she called as the scarf wound around his body. He was both shocked and annoyed that he was caught like this. He was falling and from an extremely high place, so Todoroki shot out his ice once more, creating a slide for their teacher to slide down on. He skids to a stop in front of them. Yamamo pulled the HNDFFS out of her belt and kneeled down, snapping them on his wrists. It went all according to plan, but don't you think it went a little too smooth? Todoroki asked. Yamamo straightened herself out, looking down at their teacher with a frown. Honestly, I'm not sure. When I was going to launch the catapult, I missed the first time. Todoroki's eyes widened in shock. Aizawa-sensei could have jumped away and dodged, but instead jumped back, still in the line of fire. It looked like he was allowing himself to get caught, she finished, looking over at Todoroki then back at Aizawa. I was trying to be careful of Todoroki. I could see you, but I couldn't see him. I thought he would freeze me, so I thought the best course of action was to jump back. He looked away. He could have jumped away as they were putting the HNDCFFS on, could have fought back, but at the end of the day, this was a test for his students, a test on two of the most diverse and yet similar ones in his class. It was just as you said, it was only a matter of time. Todoroki sighed in relief. Thanks. Yamamo didn't say anything. She covered her mouth with her hand, tears brimming but not falling. When it's all said and done, Sho has a soft heart. He could have at many times fought them like a real villain would, but rather decided the best course of action was to help his students while giving them their test. Midoriya smiled to himself, then felt his blood run cold. I guess I should get going. Where are you? Oh, Iida nodded, pressing a gentle kiss to his hand once more, rather than giving him an uncomfortable hug. I did this to myself, but I need closure, he replied, then looked up at the screen. You know, I still talk to Dash. What about him? Iida asked quickly. He didn't like to mention him at all. It was one thing for Midoriya almost trying to reform him, but another to speak about him. He's taught me some things I plan to use against the #1 hero. I don't think Dash. I won't stop watching your fight because of that. Shoto and I will be watching the entire fight, Iida assured. Midoriya smiled, grabbing his hand and pressing a gentle kiss to the palm. I won't lie, I'm terrified right now, he sighed, looking towards the door that will eventually lead him to the testing room where they would tell him where to go. But at some point, I need to put aside bitter feelings I have for someone and work with them, and beating him at a test sounds pretty nice to me. Then beat him, Midori, Iida replied. Midoriya beamed, then dropped his hand gently, walking towards the door, taking a deep breath in and opened it. Now the hard part began. Notes. The next chapter is finally the one y'all have been waiting for. All Might vs Midoriya and Bakugo. Chapter 68. Summary. Here it is, the long-awaited Bakugo and Midoriya vs All Might fight. I really hate how All Might was shown as this savior in the anime for Midoriya, who already given something so cool, and yet he couldn't live as a minority and instead had to live as most of the population of the world lived as. I really hated that idea. You could have used this idea to show that a minority could live and rise up against the odds, but instead decided that following the pack was the better idea for the show, and I really thought it could have gone somewhere completely different. Nonetheless, I still loved the show and still love it. I just wished at times that Midoriya would have been portrayed as a quirkless kid who fought tooth and nail, kinda like how he does in this fic, to live in a world he desired most as a kid. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Midoriya walked almost as quickly as his mind was going. He kept his head up, scanning every single area of the field, trying to figure out how to best maneuver around a place that wasn't built for someone like him. But he also needed to talk to Bakugo. You planned this test, right? Why are we together? Bakugo asked suddenly, stopping and turning to look at Midoriya with a set-off curiosity. He didn't want to tell him how All Might essentially encourage him to kill himself by telling him there is no place for the quirkless. That you can't be a hero. That he should stop his enrollment in the hero course because he will get hurt. He isn't as good of a person as you thought, is what he said, his mask slipping for a second to reveal the slight hurt that came from that thought. What do you mean? He demanded, the crazy look of panic in his eyes. Bakugo, how long have you known me? He asked, his voice unwavering. Answer my question first. How long have you known me? Midoriya stood still, his eyes flickering around the city for signs of the pro-hero. Since we were F&D kids, what does this have to do with you hating All Might? He demanded once more. Midoriya didn't have the heart to tell him that the hero he had secretly idolized with Midoriya was actually a piece of garbage. Trust me when I say, he isn't a good person, Midoriya answered once again. Bakugo clenched his fist, trying his best not to lash out in anger. Just tell me damn. The day you told me to kill myself, he essentially told me to do the same thing. Midoriya finally shouted in response. Bakugo flinched, taking a small step back. What? He told me the world has no room for quirkless heroes, and now has gone out of his way to tell me I will never be a hero, that I cannot be a hero without a flashy quirk. He lowered his gaze, feeling shame rise in him for some unknown reason. Maybe it was the need to keep his former best friend happy. Maybe he didn't want to be the one to bash his dreams in. But the quick look of hurt that flashed across his face before it was replaced by anger was one Midoriya would never forget. Bakugo Bakugo continued to walk forward, this time with a slight grudge against the pro. Just shut the F up and follow me. Midoriya did as he was told, curious as to why he was. Where are we going? They still needed to talk about a plan of action, but Bakugo didn't want to talk anymore. We are going to beat the shit out of a shitty hero. Don't know who's worse at this point, Endeavor or All Might. The students, who had already taken their tests and weren't too exhausted to move, were gathered around the large screen, watching the final test of the day, Bakugo and Midoriya versus All Might. And they were in various states of shock and anger. That's not manly at all, Kirishima practically growled. They had all heard, though muffled until Recovery Girl had turned it up, the past history All Might and Midoriya shared. Aren't these being recorded? Uraraka asked, Tsuyu next to her holding her hand gently. They are, but sadly he is the #1 hero, so he might get away with the blatant intolerance to the quirkless. She replied, keeping the volume turned up. They all watched as Bakugo, the typically violent one that hated Midoriya, dragged him along, ready to kill All Might. Should we get his soulmates? Uraraka asked. Recovery Girl shook her head gently. They recently found out about Midoriya's teacher. He had to tell them last minute or they would have suched his teacher one way or another. She sighed, looking over at the worried teens then back up at the screen. I have no doubt they know and would do just about anything to prevent him from getting hurt. One moment the teens were walking down the empty street, the next they were getting blown away by a particularly strong gust of wind. Who gives a damn about destroying a city? All Might called as he walked forward through the smoke and dust of the now damaged street. Midoriya turned his head. The fanboy in him was shocked at how much damage his quirk could do, but the rational side was scared, angry, and annoyed at him. What is this sense of intimidation? Both teens thought as All Might slammed his foot down, causing a much weaker gust of air to blow away the remaining dust cloud. If you think of this as an exam, you will be sorry, he growled out. Midoriya flinched slightly at the tone of his voice, which only made Bakugo even angrier. I am a villain, heroes. Ian, right you are, Bakugo snapped back, lowering his chest, trying to center his gravity once again. I've heard about what you've done, you aren't in any FNG position to even teach here. What? All Might's eyes proceed to dart to Midoriya and then Bakugo, then back to Midoriya again, his smile twisted even further to one that showed his rage. Young Midoriya, did you twist the story to make it seem like I was the bad guy? He asked, stretching slightly, getting ready to fail the students almost instantly. Who was it that went against his mother's wishes and is now bound to a much older man? That dash. Who is it that asked me if he could be a hero, asking for my honesty? All dash. Who is it that continues to run into danger even though he is a quirkless child who would someday amount to nothing? Even though these phrases were ones he was used to thinking of, ones that he was used to hearing, it stung more when they came from the man he looked up to for years. So, quirkless child who demands to be a hero. All Might's smile widened as he lowered his body. Come at me with everything you got? Deku! Bakugo called as Midoriya ran headfirst into danger. For the first time since he could remember, Midoriya was running blindly into a situation, an emotional situation, that is, and it terrified him. Stay out of this, he called back, trying to gather what small ideas he had for a plan and use what he could. That's right, run into your demise, All Might bellowed like the villain he was portraying, though it wasn't too far off from his actual opinion on the child. Running towards me won't outrun the truth, even you can't understand that a quirkless child is no fit in this society. He growled out as he grabbed Midoriya's face in his hand, squeezing hard but not hard enough to leave a mark. Instead of trying to get away, he was kicking, trying to land a hit on him while he was this close. Pathetic, he spat, grabbing his arm then slamming his body into the ground harshly. Midoriya gasped for whatever air he could take as it was all forced out of his body. Deku! Bakugo started to run towards him, but something in him, as if someone was screaming in his mind to stay there, don't help him. All Might moved his hand away, slowly standing up as he watched Midoriya gasp for air like a fish on land. The boy glared up at him before his eyes rolled back once more, almost savoring the darkness. With such a pathetic attempt at a hit, I have no doubt it would only sting like a mosquito bite, the teacher said with a huff, dusting himself off then turning back to look for Bakugo. In an instant he ran behind the terrified boy, the same gleam he had in his eyes when looking at Midoriya was now focused on him. Where do you think you're going, young Bakugo? All Might huffed, his tone almost satisfied that he already had taken care of the quirkless pest. Do you believe running away and hiding from your teammate will help you pass the test? I thought he was the #1 hero? Bakugo thought bitterly, leaping back, though All Might just stood there, sighing as he watched their fate. This will be interesting, he huffed. Bakugo looked back to see Midoriya sprinting towards them, something in his hand, but otherwise he looked insane trying to run towards the pro. Midoriya! Bakugo shouted. The team didn't move, rather he jumped, using his arms as a way to keep the momentum going and landed, continuing his hunt for All Might. This is an interesting test, the hero called as Bakugo for the first time in his life had to qualms about running away and quickly with his teammate. It wasn't for him but rather for Midoriya's self-destructive behavior. Also because he was on special watch and if something went wrong he would be taken from the hero course faster than he can say the word no. Bakugo, what are you doing? The teen hissed, clutching his side then pocketing the small item into a side pouch on his utility belt. Saving your butt so we can both pass the FING test, he grumbled as they stopped in a random alleyway. He's toying with us, he could have easily dashed. I know, he's a sick son of a bitch who wants to rid the world of quirkless people. He jabbed a finger at his chest harshly, and you just happen to be at the top of his FNG list. No one said anything. They took the next few moments of silence to catch their breath, waiting for the other to say something or rather for All Might to find them. Do you have a plan? Bakugo asked. He knew the kid. I don't, he replied simply, patting his pockets to make sure nothing fell out during their mix-up with All Might. You always have a plan, how do you expect us to win? He asked. Midoriya shook his head, pulling out what seemed to be a much smaller knife, a ninja's kunai. We can't win, Bakugo. This is All Might. I wish there was a way to beat him, but being the #1 hero means you can beat up high school students. He replied, slowly standing up. Bakugo stood back up once again, peering his head out of the alley only for his blood to run cold. "He's gone," he replied. Midoriya sighed and started to walk out. This wasn't like him at all. "Let me go. Didn't you have a goal to defeat the #1 hero? I only want to beat him up because dash. And this is what you get for running away, young Bakugo." Suddenly All Might flew up into the air, using his quirk to propel a metal fence that pinned him down almost instantly. The moment he hit the ground, All Might charged at Midoriya, punching him straight into the gut, but Midoriya was quicker. With the moment he had, the split-second moments, he placed a small item on the underside of his arm, that way the pro couldn't see it and Midoriya could follow through with what little he had of a plan. The teen was shoved forward, the leftover energy of his quirk propelled the teen back, vomiting as he did so, then plowed into the ground. "Wait until the plan works, All Might," he thought bitterly, his eyes closed slightly as he watched the pro stalk over to Bakugo. "I can tell you're angry, and from what I've heard it was young Midoriya's fault," All Might said with a smile, looking away from Midoriya and the scene in front of him. "But there is no reason to be angry. Level 1 and level 50 have nothing in common except both started from the same place. Do you understand?" All Might turned to Bakugo with open arms. "You do, don't you? Young Midoriya has no room to grow while you can increase your strength exponentially." "Shut up, All Might," he growled, trying to stand up, but the fence kept him planted in the ground. The teacher sighed, picking up the fence out of the ground easily, then tossed it aside. "Don't you get it? Quirkless people don't have a place in the world anymore," he called, looking at Midoriya with disdain. "I can help you get stronger, dash." "I don't want your help, scum," he growled, glaring at the man. "I would rather lose than get your help." "So be it," All Might sighed, looking at the weights then at the student who could barely move due to the fence that had left a bruise on his back. Instantly Midoriya shot up, ignoring the shortness of breath and flares of pain as he ran, throwing a perfectly aimed kunai into his fist. He picked up Bakugo and started to run away with him, albeit not fast. All Might was more interested in the situation than letting his students run away. "I didn't think young Midoriya would try to help him, especially after what he's done to the boy." All Might chuckled. He was having fun ruining the kid's dreams as well. "But man, are these heavy. I can't believe this is happening, Ribbit," Saya whispered. She had come in a tad later but was still as shocked as the rest of her class. "The #1 hero hates quirkless people?" Uraraka asked herself, watching as Midoriya, who was clearly having issues breathing and even moving, picked Bakugo up and started to run away. "We have to stop the test, this dash." Recovery Girl looked over at Iida, then at the screen. Midoriya was the one who planned this. He knew what he was getting himself into, though I doubt he really thought it through. She mumbled the second half to herself, looking at the next camera that showed All Might walking carefully through the damaged city. "I'm afraid this will end up with injuries that will take time to heal," Recovery Girl continued, looking over at his platonic soulmates. "Go get his soulmates. I know what you share is special, but they need to be here for this." Without a second thought, Iida revved his engines and sprinted out of the room, trying to locate Midoriya's soulmates. "BSU put me down," Bakugo growled. He knew how hurt Midoriya was. A blow to the stomach from All Might wasn't something most people were able to stand. But here he was, carrying another student while injured. It's fine," he huffed, trying to regulate his breathing. "I said put me down." He struggled out of his grip while punching his lower back just hard enough to agitate the new wound. He got to let the teen go. "Bakugo, I can't think of a way to make a clean escape with both of us or find a way to defeat him to pass the test," Midoriya let out, clutching his lower ribs. But if we work together and if we tag team this dash." "You can't help me." Bakugo snapped, trying to stand up through the large, horizontal bruise made it unsurprisingly hard to stand. He will if'n kill you, Deku. I have a fame quirk and you have that brain of yours. Bakugo, I can't let you go out there by yourself. You see the state I'm in? He will kill you, or at least come close to killing you." He sighed, relishing in what little air he was slowly regaining, and the even pace that it slowly came back in. "Use me, let me dash." All of a sudden Bakugo slammed his hand against the wall next to Midoriya's head, an explosion going off that made Midoriya's ears ring. "He's faster than us, stronger than us, stronger than you, faster than you," Bakugo sighed, moving his arm, then looked at the exit to the alley, then back at Midoriya. "I have an idea." Iida came bursting back. Aizawa and Yamada only a beat behind him, all struck with worry. Iida only told us he was hurt. What's happening? Yamada asked, clutching Aizawa's hand with a death grip. The students knew it was very unlike them to show affection to the other, as they were teachers and wanted to keep it professional, though with Midoriya it was another situation. So they knew if they were blatantly showing affection, even holding hands, this was serious and they were scared. I can show you the videos later. For now, stay here and watch. I have no doubt he turned his bond off so you couldn't feel his emotions. The teachers agreed. It's only been 10 minutes, but too long in their opinion to have essentially radio silence from their soulmate. I think the most surprising part is Bakugo. He has been brash like normal, but it's for Midoriya's sake, not because of his personal grudge, Todoroki added. No one dared look away from the screen. What do you mean? Aizawa asked. This was a surprise to him, that the most explosive kid in his class was being brash not because of a student but rather for the sake of them. You will see shortly, was all he said, as the idea of trying to explain it was too confusing for him. All Might was now running on screen, and the bonded pair watched in horror as their soulmate and his former bully went out in the open. Where are you looking, huh? Bakugo shouted, trying to draw All Might's attention to him rather than Midoriya. So, you were behind me? All Might asked, turning around only to be met by a series of explosions. Bakugo, with tears in his eyes, continued to send them one after the other. Who would ever work with a piece of sheet like you? He yelled. A part of him agreed with the man that quirkless people shouldn't have a place in the world. But another, much louder part screamed to let them have a place. He's seen what Midoriya could do and could only imagine what other quirkless people could do in the world if given the chance. It's why he was fighting him, to give Midoriya that chance. Deku! He screamed, his voice hoarse from the raw, bitter emotions he's had to face, and it wasn't even halfway through the allowed test time. Midoriya appeared behind All Might, one of Bakugo's gauntlets on his wrist, as he stopped behind him, then smirked. Bakugo launched himself into the air, keeping himself up with his own series of smaller explosions. Shoot! Midoriya pulled the pin to the grenade. All of a sudden a large explosion tore through the grenade, the force ripping his arm back in what felt like, once again, a dislocated shoulder. Run, you idiot! Bakugo called, as Midoriya, clutching his arm and the gauntlet, started to run as fast as he could. All Might stood behind, watching as Midoriya ran but was slowly being left behind by Bakugo. Interesting, he muttered, standing up and stretching, then in an instant appeared next to Bakugo. Bakugo tried to say his name, but his other gauntlet was broken with one hit, then smashed into the building next to him. He turned around and faced Midoriya, who had a look of anger, worry, and what seemed to be joy on his face. All Might, let's talk for a moment, shall we? He asked, keeping his palms towards the teacher. He stared at him but didn't do anything to stop him from talking. I hate you, are you aware of that? I am, now, he wanted to add, but he always had a feeling that the boy hated him. Why do you think that is? He asked, the pro side, looking back at Bakugo and then at Midoriya, who brought his hands down and started to adjust his gloves. I disapprove of your quirkless nature, and even more so that you try to prove anyone can be a hero. He replied simply. Midoriya nodded, casting him a pitted frown, then sighed. I get it truly, not everyone can mysteriously gain a quirk in high school after all, Midoriya replied. The look on All Might's face was truly priceless. He was going to ask Recovery Girl for a clip of the video just to continuously watch his expression. How did you dash? Well, I say befriending the FING principal of the school you attended that also happened to be your teacher, as well as your former teacher that also happened to keep every single yearbook the school has ever had, does have its perks. He smiled widely, hoping the teacher knew what he was putting down, and hoping Bakugo knew what he was trying to do. Mid-dash. I'm not finished yet. I would also like to ask you to mind your language, as these tests are being recorded for the sake of the teachers and all staff to look back and figure out what they need to improve on. He adjusted his utility belt, subtly grabbing a remote from a pouch, and continued to fix his sleeves and gloves. Which means they will be looking to improve upon the position of the heroics teacher, All Might. I love your attitude, kid. You remind me when I was young. Midoriya sighed, shaking his head, keeping his eyes trained on the teacher but using his peripheral vision to see if Bakugo had gotten up yet, and he had. I remind you of a time when it was normal to come home beaten black and blue? He asked. All Might didn't respond. I remind you of a time when you had to keep your effing head down because you didn't want to see your mom's ex-sprays. Oh wait, I don't get the luxury anymore after you dashed. He seized the air in between his teeth, trying to keep the tears at bay but failing. After you came into my home, talked to my mother and truly convinced her that I shouldn't be a hero. I get that she had always thought being quirkless was a mistake, that I will never find a place in the world, but you just cemented this thought. I really thought if I could come home after the sports festival and talk to her, that maybe she will no longer hate the idea but just stand neutrally. It was all I was expecting, but you had to be there. Midoriya sighed, rubbing the tears off his face, sniffled, then reached down for the knives Akaguro Stains had given him. I wish I never met you on that street, was all he said before pressing the trigger on the remote. Bakugo run. All Might fell to the ground in pain, but it wasn't something he couldn't withstand. Somewhere on his body was a small device sending wave after wave of electrical shock. He slowly stood up, patting his arm where the current started from until he found the small device and tore it off of him. Young Midoriya, I thought you were better than this. He grabbed Midoriya's wrist and started to run towards Bakugo. Where do you think you're going, young Bakugo? In an instant, he used Midoriya's body like a rag doll and slammed his body onto Bakugo's so hard dust flew up and both boys were rendered semi-unconscious. It was taking everything they had not to slip in. We have to get him out of there. Aizawa wasn't brash, but after seeing All Might use their soulmate like a FING weapon, all reason flew out the window. Show stop, Yamada whispered. He gripped his other hand then looked towards the screen. Right now he's trying his hardest to fight and pass his test, to prove not even the shittiest top hero can be above quirkless people, and if we stop the test, he may never prove that to anyone again. But Yamada pressed a gentle kiss to his lips. Any bystanders watching weren't going to say a thing, and both men sighed. Fine, he only has 10 minutes left, what could happen? Bakugo gritted his teeth as All Might slammed his foot on his back, keeping him from getting up with what felt like only half his body weight. You will never beat me, and you, young Midoriya, the quirkless thorn in my side, All Might scoffed, watched the boy as he tried to scrape at his hand, the fear written all over his face. What's with that look? I thought you wanted to prove quirkless people could be heroes. He threw Midoriya across the street, the boy trying his best not to let out the guttural scream that tore through his body when the pro used his dislocated shoulder to his advantage. You lost. Something seemingly snapped in Bakugo when these words were said. His gauntlets made it much easier to make a large explosion, but he was perfectly capable of making just one shot with his palm, and what little sweat was stuck under the glove. He screwed his eyes shut, feeling as his palm heated up. He wouldn't let the explosion go until it was hot enough. Once he knew his hand was a glowing red, he flexed his hand and let it ring out. All Might, in his state of confusion, moved back, letting Bakugo jump up and find Midoriya in the smoke. Though he tried to stab Bakugo, yet he was aiming too high for a reason. Calm down, you nerd, it's just me. He grabbed the mask Midoriya typically wore around his neck then smirked. I'm gonna send you flying. You what? Send you flying, Deku. Bakugo turned around, using his bad hand to support his wrist. He heated it up once more then masked the scream of agony with a word he was typically shouting, die. Midoriya was thrown into the air. He watched with a smile as the gate got closer and the smoke cloud behind him was still up. As long as we get one person across the line we pass. He said to himself. All of a sudden the smoke behind him cleared. A pit formed in his stomach, but he kept his head forward. New Hampshire smash. All Might called. Midoriya didn't want to turn around. Instead, he kept his head focused on the goal, though it was a grave mistake on his part. All of a sudden, All Might's body was planted into the lower of his spine, making him arch his back in a painful way. The older man seemingly rolled off his body as Midoriya was thrown into the destroyed bus and hit the ground painfully. Go, Deku, hurry. Midoriya looked over at Bakugo, who was supporting his wrist as he let off another explosion. The same explosion he used at the sports festival? But he only used it once back then, and he saw his arms twitching, how he gritted his teeth. He was in immense pain, and that didn't settle well with Midoriya. Just go, Deku. He shouted. Midoriya started to lift his body off the ground. Waves of pain shot through his lower back, but he would persist and continue to fight through it just like Bakugo was. Midoriya, hunched over severely, staggered towards the gate while Bakugo let off explosion after explosion, breaking his arms as he did so. I will make dashed, his vision blurred as he staggered forward. I will make it to the gate. Kaken will only distract him for so long. He took a deep, painful breath in, realizing he still had a job to do, and continued forward, a knife clutched tightly in his hand. He will go after me since I'm by the gate. He didn't have to turn back to know the explosions stopped and All Might was on his trail. He should take advantage of that. Bakugo jumped up, letting off an explosion that once again shattered his arm, but All Might dodged, grabbed his head, and slammed it into the ground with as much force as he could do without killing him. I'm sorry, young Bakugo, but as your teacher, I do not wish to see you get hurt, he muttered softly as if he truly did care about Bakugo. Just, All Might felt small explosions go off. Bakugo, with what little consciousnesses he had left, was trying to keep all the attention on him. Go Deku. What dash? IW won't let a piece of sheet, like Tkuda win, he growled, biting All Might's hand with what little strength he had left. Kaken! Midoriya shouted, grabbing the knives from his pockets, as he was only a few feet away now. I won't let you dash. His sentence got cut off by a knife being stabbed as deep as it could go into his right shoulder. All Might jumped back, clutching his shoulder without pulling the knife out, and watched as Midoriya scooped Bakugo up and started to run. All Might coughed harshly, blood seeping out, but Midoriya did not see nor care to look back as his one goal was to get past the finish line within the time limit. I didn't think you would do this again, he said to himself, watching as Midoriya practically dragged their combined weight to the goal. You did this one other time when you saved him from the sludge villain, and I thought it was a fluke that you were doing it for attention. All Might didn't lift his head when the pair got past the goal nor move from his spot. Maybe I was wrong about you. Maybe quirkless people have a chance in the world if they try. I know I didn't try before she came and found me. Notes. I hoped you loved it. I will be excited to post the aftermath of the chapter tomorrow, and I believe there are about 2 to 3 more chapters after this and the FIC is over. And yes, there will be a final epilogue to wrap the story up nicely instead of leaving it how it is with a ton of loose threads. Chapter 69. Summary. Hey, sorry guys, I'm gonna be posting the last 3 chapters today to make up for not posting the last few days because of schoolwork. I cannot believe I am doing this. Well, to the last 3. Here we go. Midoriya let the bitter tears fall when he saw the goal getting even closer. He hadn't heard All Might move since he had stabbed him. Let this be the end, he gritted out, looking down to see Bakugo unconscious, though it was the least of his worries, as being asleep, though not in the way intended, let his mind rest, and Midoriya did not have that luxury. Izuku! A familiar voice called. He turned his head and watched as his soulmates came into view. With a newfound determination, he pulled himself and Bakugo through the gate and collapsed into their arms as the signal for the test was over. I passed, he whispered, letting the tears roll down his cheeks. Does Bakugo have a soulmate? Yeah, but he doesn't like people finding out, dude. A voice spoke up behind them. He turned his head to see Kirishima standing there looking at him with a small smile, then looking around for his soulmate. Speaking of, where is he? Right here, Midoriya whispered, unable to raise his voice in fear of hurting it more. He shakily lifted Bakugo's body. His soulmates realized what was happening and Aizawa grabbed his student. Can you take him back to Recovery Girl? Aizawa asked. Kirishima nodded, using his quirk slightly to keep his soulmate elevated. Tell her to look at his arms, please, Midoriya whispered, leaning against Yamada, his arms wrapped loosely against his waist. Overused his quirk. Thanks, Midoriya. He faced Aizawa and Yamada. Take care of him, we all know he wouldn't otherwise. With that, Kirishima ran off. Aizawa pressed a kiss against his forehead, sighing and looking towards the testing field where he saw All Might. Show not right now, is all Yamada said, though he too wanted to give the pro a piece of his mind. Let's just go. Back, Midoriya whispered. He let go of Yamada and started to stagger forward, though it didn't last that long as Aizawa had scooped him up gently. When he realized Midoriya couldn't stand letting his back relax in that position, Yamada helped him down, then placed Midoriya on Aizawa's back, as his hair was a greater weapon than All Might's quirk. Thank you. He nuzzled into the back of Aizawa's neck, letting his face be covered by the scarves, and sighed. What you did won't escape punishment. You could have died. We saw you get thrown into a truck. Yamada added. Midoriya closed his eyes, nodding slightly. But we are proud of you. You stood up against the #1 hero and essentially foiled his plot of trying to get you out of UA because quirkless students shouldn't be allowed here. Aizawa continued. Midoriya nodded, keeping himself awake because he was sure his concussion had a concussion of its own. Izuku, Yamada cooed. He cracked his eyes open and saw Yamada staring at him. Stay awake, Songbird. Trying, he slurred. Midoriya lifted his head and looked at Yamada. Kisses? Okay. He cupped his head gently and placed a kiss on his lips. Midoriya smiled sleepily into the kiss, though quick it was much appreciated. Show kiss? Midoriya parroted. Aizawa shook his head then sighed. I can't kiss you while you're on my back, Aizu. When you rest up then we can? He replied. He whined slightly but didn't fight his decision. Did why watch me? He asked. Yamada nodded, trying to keep a smile on his face though it was obvious through the bond Midoriya had yet to turn back on, that neither of his soulmates was happy right now. We did, Songbird, and we are proud of what you did. Look, we're already here. He pushed the tent open, as the proper walk to Recovery Girl's room was too far and most students were coming back with bruises and the occasional broken bone. Aizawa carefully walked in and placed his younger soulmate on the bed. He whined slightly at the loss of warmth but didn't say anything, a small pout on his lips. Where is he? Recovery Girl asked as she walked in. They pointed to the bed and she sighed. No doubt he dished that much abuse because you're quirkless. I know, I had a reason to fight him. He muttered as she placed a kiss on his head, clearing up the fogginess in his head easily though it made him sleepy. What was your reason then? Aizawa asked. He could still feel the emptiness in his chest where the bond from Midoriya was shut off and it made him annoyed. He looked around to make sure there was no one else but the 3 adults around them then sighed. No one would have believed me otherwise. He's the #1 hero and even then he's given some leeway when it comes to the dislike and mistreatment of quirkless people. Izuku, Aizawa sighed. Before they could say anything else someone knocked on the frame of the tent. All Might walked in, ducking his head so he could get through then waved. Is this a dash? A knife narrowly missed his head. It skimmed his cheek leaving a sizable cut, and planted itself into the top of the frame. I missed, Midoriya muttered, making All Might's blood run cold. Why you missed? He parroted looking at Yamada and Aizawa then Recovery Girl. I came here to talk to you young Midor dash. Whatever you have to say can be said in front of all of us, he replied, undoing the top of his hero costume so Recovery Girl could look at his injuries without having to guess. I wanted to apologize for my behavior. When no one interrupted he continued, I would like it if the press dash this time 2 kunai hit him, 1 for each piece of hair sticking up and it kept him at the front of the tent. The kunai buried deep into the frame of the tent. Aizawa rolled his eyes when he saw his soulmate holding 2 more, having taken them from his own utility belt. You only care about yourself, huh? He sighed, looking at his soulmates then back at All Might. The press won't find out. Izuku dash. Songbird dash. I won't tell the press because Japan can't stand to lose the symbol of peace, even though he's full of shit. Midoriya glared at the pro then his gaze softened when he looked at his soulmates. If there were another way to keep the world stable and get him thrown down a few pegs I would. I thought about it during the fight, and there isn't another way. There is another way though, Recovery Girl piped up. She had left the area for a moment to get large bandages and cream for the bruises on his torso. If the people here could accept a new #1 hero then it would work. I would rather take a #1 hero that abuses quirkless kids instead of his own kids, Midoriya replied bluntly. Meeting a quirkless kid in today's society is very rare now, so I would rather take All Might than Endeavor. Young Midoriya another kunai was thrown at him, grazing his other cheek. I'm not doing this for you, I'm doing this for Japan, was all he said before hissing at the slight pain that shot through his lower back as Recovery Girl treated the severely damaged part of his spine. Anything else, All Might? Yamada asked, crossing his arms and glaring at the taller man who had pulled the kunai out of his hair then handed them to Yamada along with both of Midoriya's knives. It's a silly rumor, but do you still keep contact with the hero killer? All Might asked. Midoriya rolled his eyes but sighed anyway before answering. So what if I do? He asked. All Might's eyes widened in shock. He didn't expect a child to be after him in terms of murder now. Did he set you up dash? Up to what? Revealing your secrets or trying not to kill you? He asked, letting Aizawa guide him onto the bed properly to rest. I wasn't implying that dash. I think it's time you leave All Might, Midoriya mumbled, a small smile playing on his lips. I'm sorry, Tashinori Yagi. Midoriya's smile grew wider when he saw the fear settle in All Might. Just how much do you know about me? He asked. Aizawa and Yamada, even Recovery Girl, watched in awe as the #1 hero was essentially trembling before a quirkless student. I will congratulate the government and the hero network that hid most of your past. You as well had no issue doing the same, but there was something you forgot. He smiled and watched as his face turned to one of confusion. What? I study quirks and your teacher, Nana Shimura dash. How dash? Let me finish or I tell them all the big secret. Aizawa hasn't felt a deep-rooted fear like this before. Watching his soulmate unravel a man twice his size and age was scary. Watching him unravel a man that was the #1 hero in Japan was terrifying. But he had to admit it was hot. He shared a look with Yamada who had the same emotions. Fear, shock, pride, and just like Aizawa, lust. Anyways, I have noticed, going back farther and farther until I found not one, but rather two common threads that link everything together so neatly that it almost explains everything. He motioned for him to come closer. The pro leaned down and kept his eyes trained to the floor. You somehow possess a quirk that Nana had, as well as her teacher and their teacher before. You possess a quirk that can be past, and what's better, it's somehow linked to the villain that should have killed you when you fought him the first time. All for one. All Might jumped back in shock, fear written over his face. I cannot stress how valuable that information is, young Midoriya. If any villain or someone willing to sell that dash, Midoriya waved his hand, laying back down. I know, it's why the League of Villains wants me, was all he said. All Might froze, staring at the boy then his soulmates who made no move to deny it. I think I need to speak to Nezu about this. With that he walked out, leaving Midoriya exhausted and smiling at his soulmates. What did you tell him? Aizawa asked. Midoriya smiled and placed a finger on his lover's lips. If I told any of you it would put you all in a life or death situation, the League would murder anyone for what I know show. He responded. Aizawa held his hand, pressing a kiss against his palm. Then why do you get to know? Yamada asked. Midoriya sighed, reaching out with his other hand to hold his. Because I figured it out. I still know more than what I told him. He looked at Recovery Girl who had walked away at some point to find more bandages, though she just wanted to give them privacy. Speaking of the League, they still want me. He muttered and tried to sit up, but his soulmates kept him held down. Rest, Aizu, we will take you back inside soon enough and they can't get on campus, at least not after the first time they did it. Yamada said with a sigh, still holding his hand. Midoriya nodded and looked at Aizawa then Yamada with a soft smile. I love you both, he yawned letting his exhaustion take over, but before falling asleep he let the bond open once more. Tears sprung to his eyes when he felt their rush of emotions, the bitter fear present but mostly the love and kindness he craves from them coming at him at full speed. Love you too, Songbird. Yamada pressed a kiss to his forehead. Aizawa, being cheeky, pressed one on the corner of his lips. I love you to Kitten. Midoriya fell asleep with a small smile and his soulmates around him protectively. Chapter 70. Notes. Okay, I am very nervous because after this there is one more chapter and I kinda don't want to do it, but this FIC and chapter of my life needs to come to an end. Let's do this. Kurogiri, Shigaraki grumbled. He glanced over briefly at Toga and Dabi then back to the warp gate. Get rid of these idiots. I don't need a brat and a guy with no manners. Now sure dash. Before Kurogiri could say anything else, Toga bounded over to Shigaraki pouting slightly. But Shiga, you will be lonely if you didn't have us around, she giggled, letting the small blade that sat in her sleeve fall into her grasp. She didn't have it to threaten him but rather to play with it. Besides, Aizu knows me very well and you want Aizu, right? Shigaraki didn't say anything. Instead, he picked up a jacket, keeping his pinky raised as to not disintegrate it, then tugged it on. Where are you going, Shiga? Toga asked as she touched the small blade against her lips. Are you leaving because I made you sad? No, you brat, I have the stuff to do, and that doesn't mean you can come with me. He opened the door then slammed it, walked towards his new destination with a frown. Toga, Izuku is the only reason why he wants to join the league. Everyone, I look forward to hearing how C camp was, Mina sniffled. She, Kaminari, Sato, and Kirishima failed to pass their exam, which meant they were forced to stay back and take a makeup class while everyone else was at camp. Gee guys, it's okay, and maybe out of some sort of twist of fate you might be able to go, Midoriya offered, knowing for a fact if they didn't go he would hound his soulmate until he let them come. Stop Midoriya, Shiro started, placing a hand on his shoulder. I think by saying that out loud you are just jinxing them. They said whoever failed their exams had to skip school training camp and sit through summer school hell. We didn't pass the practicals, so we're doomed. Kaminari turned around and met his gaze. Don't you get it, Midoriya? Or did All Might knock all your brains out? The group went silent for a moment. Kaminari, realizing he took it too far, had back away immediately. Midori dashed. It's okay, he replied, a soft smiling resting on his face. It's okay, me and Bakugo both beat him, and besides dash, he let a wicked grin tug at his lips. I scared him. I can see why, Kirishima chimed in almost instantly. When the bell rings everyone should be in their seats, Aizawa stated as he slammed the door open. Almost instantly everyone rushed to their seats. Midoriya smiled and waved to his soulmate, who only smiled softly back. As you know, we are leaving for the training camp in a few days, and there are a couple of you that didn't pass your practical exam. So when it comes to the training camp in the woods dash, Midoriya watched as the few who didn't pass looked away. He then cast his gaze towards his soulmate, who was now grinning in an almost unsettling way. Everyone is going. Seriously? Mina asked, tears brimming her eyes. Yeah, he responded, his gaze falling onto his soulmate, then looked back at the rest of the class. The good news is no one bombed the written test, but 5 failed the practical badly, 2 teams of course, and Shiro failed as well. Ugh, I knew it, Shiro mumbled, face palming and shaking his head. But on the upside, Shinso gets to stay in the class now, Midoriya chimed in. After all that has happened, some people in the class were questioning why Minetta wasn't making comments, and that was because he was gone, having been replaced by another purple-haired student who had earned his spot in the class. Midoriya smiled as he watched Ojiro look back at Kaminari, who was looking at Shinso with a proud grin. Aizawa seemingly noticed this too and decided to get the rest of the class back on track. Allow me to explain, Aizawa interjected, but by the giddy look on his soulmate's face, he would have to let him come up and explain the test in a bit. For the practical battles, the teachers made sure to give the students a way to win. Can Midoriya explain? He was the one who made the pairings, Karo? Azui asked. Midoriya looked back then at his soulmate, who nodded and stepped out of the way so he could be at the podium. Midoriya walked up, having fished out the binder he used and needed to give to Nedzu with his evaluations on all the tests, and brought it up to the front of the class. The teachers would try to give you an advantage, but I knew how it was going to be planned, and I didn't think as many of you would have passed, not without hurting yourselves a lot more. He explained, looking around at the class then back at his teacher. I gave everyone an advantage, whether it was due to quirks being the same or exploiting weaknesses a teacher has, they were all there. But we aren't you bro, we can't see them. Kirishima pipped up and Midoriya nodded. You didn't know to look for them, but you found them. Azui, with your quirk you were able to hide the HNDCFFS, but both of you exploited the fact that your teacher relies on his clones more than his fighting skills. Midoriya cast his gaze towards Yamamoto and Todoroki. Sho has a habit of using his quirk too much or too little. What he lacks in using his quirk he makes up in the fighting. But you used his impatience and need to continuously scout an area to your advantage by making the only street he could see you on the one he had to go down himself. Aizawa grumbled something under his breath, but Midoriya knew it wasn't anything about how he was wrong, but rather right. So I don't get it, we could have passed? Mina asked. Midoriya nodded, then opened Mina and Kaminari's tab in the book. Nedzu has a knowledge-based quirk. He can't see into the future or even have strength, but what he lacks in power he makes up in brain power. There was a way, yes, to beat him, but running in terror as a tea-drinking maniac swinging a crane at you was not the way to do it. He scolded lightly. Both students looked away in what he assumed was a shame. Anyways, if the teachers didn't ask for my help, you would have been paired up differently, given different teachers and even different environments. I set everything up to ensure you had a chance against pro heroes. Midoriya pointed out, looking at his soulmate as if he wasn't one of the people that were against him making the tests. But what about you and Bakugo against All Might? How is that fair? Kirishima pipped up. Aizawa looked at him with the same look. How is that fair? He parroted. Midoriya rolled his eyes, then faced Kirishima. To put it shortly, it wasn't. We had the #1 hero in Japan, and I happen to know he hates quirkless people, and I had a grudge. Sure, I was biased, but Bakugo would have wanted the same teacher, and besides, there isn't anyone else besides Kirishima who can stand up against him. Midoriya replied. Kirishima's eyes widened in shock. Was he really going to give up his secret? Why is that? Todoroki chimed in. Midoriya smiled, then looked at his platonic soulmate. His quirk, of course, everyone else has something very offensive. It can be used defensively, but Kirishima is the only one who can withstand his blasts even at close range, Midoriya explained. Kirishima visibly deflated, relieved he would be able to keep the secret just a bit longer. Anyway, the teachers wanted to observe how you did, how you worked together with someone, and what you overcame during the tests. The teachers held back. They were given strict instructions to. He cast his gaze down to his soulmate who was idly flipping through the notebook. But I thought they were supposed to use their full power? Ojiro asked. Aizawa nodded, looking down at his student. We just said that to keep you on edge, as to make sure the students would use their full power thus far. Besides, the training camp will focus on building your strength. Those who failed to need these lessons the most, we were never going to separate you. Aizawa said simply, then a wide smile broke out across his face. That was just a logical deception we used. Aizawa-sensei, aren't you concerned that if you keep lying then we won't take your word for anything? Iida asked. Midoriya covered his mouth to silence his giggles while his soulmate nodded. I will take that into consideration, but I wasn't lying to you entirely. His gaze shifted to the 5 students who were previously cheering about going to the camp. Failure is failure, and we have prepared extra lessons for the 5 of you. Frankly, they will be much harder than what you will face at summer school. As Class 1A was about to leave, they were handed training camp guides, small books that gave them a schedule of the week they would be gone. Look at how busy we will be, Midoriya commented as he looked over Iida's shoulder. I think I need a bigger suitcase. And I need a new bathing suit, Kaminari commented as he pointed to the time allowed for them to go to the beach. I guess I need to buy some stuff. Guys, since we are off tomorrow and we finally finished exams, I have the best idea. Why don't we go shopping as a class? Hakigure exclaimed, her shirt waving around frantically as she tried to gesture to them, but unfortunately she couldn't be seen. Hey, yeah, we haven't hung out as a class before, Kaminari chimed in. He looked towards Ojiro, who was standing next to Shinso, their hands brushing slightly. Bakugo, see you there, right? Kirishima asked, rushing over to get his answer, but Bakugo only rolled his eyes. I can't think of anything more annoying, he replied, but Kirishima didn't feel saddened by it. After all, his soulmate was staying at his house tonight. Both having a key to the other's place made it easy to go to and from without people seeing them. Will you come, Todoroki? Midoriya asked, looking towards his platonic soulmate. The bicolored teen shook his head. No, on my free days I go to visit my mother, he replied. Midoriya nodded with a soft smile. Tell her I said hi, all right? He asked. Todoroki nodded, pressing a gentle kiss to his forehead, then walked towards Iida. See you tomorrow, guys. Text me the time we're meeting. Midoriya called, realizing his soulmates were waiting for him outside. You're going shopping tomorrow? Aizawa asked, having been standing by the door waiting for him to come out. Yeah, is that okay? He asked as they walked downstairs together, their hands brushing against the other's gently. Why wouldn't it be? Aizawa responded as they rounded the corner of the stairwell. If it's money you're worried about, I don't mind. No, it's just. He stopped walking. His gazes was trained on the floor. I've never done something like this before. Aizawa realized at this moment this was the first time his soulmate got to be a teenager. He doesn't have to worry about taking care of anyone else but himself, and it was messing him up. You can go, Aizu, he muttered, looking around before he got close enough and pulled him into his chest. There is nothing stopping you. I think Hisashi would be thrilled to know you want to go shopping. It's all he ever does sometimes. This comment made Midoriya snort. Wrapping his arms around his soulmate's neck, he brought him down for a quick kiss. You know the rules, no kisses at school, Aizawa whispered as they pulled away. I know, I just wanted a small kiss though, he replied as they continued their walk out of the building where they found Yamada waiting. What to dash? Izuku wants to go shopping tomorrow with his class, was all Aizawa said as he continued walking forward, leaving Yamada to fawn over his other soulmate. Midoriya woke up the next morning to the sound of an alarm blaring. Turn it off, Aizawa grumbled as Midoriya sat up. He was once again caught in the middle of their bed even though he fell asleep on the outside this time to make sure he could get up properly. MK, he whispered, leaning over and pressing the snooze button on his alarm clock. He pressed a quick kiss to Aizawa's lips, then leaned over and did the same to Yamada. Let money on the counter for you, Yamada muttered. Midoriya giggled to himself, then slid out of bed to get ready. Thank you, Zashi, he responded, said Soulmate smiled and rolled to face Aizawa, but neither would get any closer, as the spot in the middle was reserved for Midoriya and it felt weird to be that close without him. Midoriya got dressed quickly, having decided to wear a simple t-shirt and blue shorts. He then grabbed his school bag and took out his essential things for class, leaving small items and a few blank notebooks. He found the money on the counter with a small note on top. Have fun today, we probably won't be up to see you off, but know we love you. It wasn't signed, but he knew it was Yamada who wrote the note, as he was the only one who preferred to write in a weird cursive that he had learned being an English teacher. Midoriya grabbed both the note and money and put it into the wallet that he decided would be better off in his backpack rather than his pocket. What am I forgetting? He muttered, then smacked his lips. The awful taste of morning breath had reminded him that he had forgotten to eat something and brush his teeth. He quickly ran into the bathroom to brush his teeth and fix his mess of green curls before slipping his shoes on and deciding he will get something to eat at the mall. Oh man, do I love this place. It has a ton of different stores and they are all super cool and hip, Mina giggled looking around the mall. I love coming to the Kiyoshi Ward Mall. They have a range of clothing for all quirk users, for teens and seniors, Midoriya muttered to himself. He was nervous being in such a big place to buy things for himself. Usually it was for other people, but this time he was here to buy for himself. Midoriya, you're scaring the kids, Tokoyami scolded. Midoriya stopped his mindless chattering and walked back to the group, who was already deciding where to go in groups and breaking off to go shopping. Whoa, are those UA students? Someone called, pointing towards their group. People started to chatter and mutter about who they were. Yeah, they're from Class 1A. Another confirmed, said students were feeling a tad bashful that people still remembered who they were. I can't believe they know who we are still, Uraraka whispered to Azui, who nodded next to her. I want to track down a new duffel bag to take to the training camp, Midoriya heard Jiro say, and Yamamo had agreed to come with her to look. I needed new shoes, I can't take the ones I use in hero class. Kaminari chimed in, and slowly Midoriya realized no one would come with him to check out the craft stores where more stationery was, as well as notebooks, and even to look at weights to help improve his strength. Let's all meet here in an hour, okay? Kirishima asked. Realizing his soulmate was finally here, he had rushed off towards him, leaving Midoriya alone. We came here as a class and now I'm left alone, he muttered, looking around for the general direction of the stores he wanted to check out. Oh, someone from you, a voice called. Midoriya turned his head to look because he had a feeling he knew whose voice this was, and yet he couldn't place it. I wanted to get your autograph. The stranger slung his arm over his shoulders and around his neck, keeping Midoriya close. Why are you here? Midoriya muttered, keeping his gaze trained forward as they walked through the food court. I'm flattered, you remember who I am? Shigaraki brought his hand up to Midoriya's neck, only one finger raised, preventing him from using his quirk. How could I forget the man who has been my biggest fan? Midoriya asked with amusement in his voice. He kept his face blank, and yet his voice was what kept the villain drawn in. Toga told me you and her had a chat, he explained. Midoriya nodded, shoving his hands into his pockets. He let fear and anger flow through his bond, trying to get his sleepy soulmates up and to get to the mall. We did, she came dressed as my soulmate when I was sick, he replied as they turned down another hall that was full of stores and bustling with people. Shame on her, do you feel better? The villain asked. Midoriya nodded, casting a friendly glance. I do, she brought me food, but before we could eat my soulmate came home, he said, Fiddling with his phone, he turned the volume down and called the third contact on his list, Iida. With him, on the phone, he hoped he could hear the conversation. "Oh, Midoriya's calling," Iida called. The few classmates that were near him came as he answered the phone, putting it on speaker. Before he could say anything, he could hear Midoriya's muffled voice and another. "Shigaraki, why did you come to see me?" Iida whipped around, trying to find Midoriya. He had put the mic on his phone on mute. "Who's Shigaraki?" Tokoyami asked. Iida didn't say anything, rather he kept looking. "Get your phones out and call the class back to the food court immediately. Midoriya has been taken hostage by the leader of the League of Villains and we need to get him out of here." "Izuku, how do you do it?" Shigaraki asked, letting Midoriya lead them around the mall. They had circled back to the food court and the green-haired boy was trying to make it seem like they were just talking and he wasn't being threatened. "Do what?" he asked, looking at the different fast food places. "How do you live without a quirk? How do you see people and just know what their quirk is?" he asked. Midoriya stopped walking, then he looked up at Shigaraki with a face masked in sorrow. "Society didn't want me, so I forced society to accept me," was all he said. Midoriya felt chills run down his spine as Shigaraki smiled. "Then why don't you come back to join us?" he asked. Midoriya shook his head. "If you want info about heroes and what they do, I need to stay in UA, he bargained, knowing he was still on the phone with Iida. Of course, one step ahead of us all," Shigaraki nodded, feeling a sense of pride for the boy. "Should we get something to eat?" Midoriya asked as they passed a store, then stopped. "What is it?" Shigaraki asked as they walked in. Midoriya found a pair of cheap gloves that were fingerless minus the pinky. It seemed like it was made for someone with Shigaraki's quirk in mind. He quickly picked the gloves up and bought them before the villain had realized what was going on. "Put these on," was all he said. Shigaraki lifted his head to stare at the boy, trying to see any sign of unwavering or trickery. When Midoriya only gestured to the gloves, Shigaraki slowly peeled his fingers off his neck, then took the gloves with caution, then slipped them on, and flexed his hands. Carefully he touched his hoodie with his full hand. He started to walk around, touching random things, then approached Midoriya and grabbed his wrist. When nothing happened, the villain smiled widely. It wasn't a smile Midoriya has seen before, and yet it wasn't as unsettling as his other expressions. "What are these?" he asked, sitting down on a bench to inspect the gloves. "They are made for your quirk type, one that requires all your fingers to be touching something to do something. Since 4 of your fingers are bare, you can't use your quirk when you grab things, but only one is touching the fabric, so it can't destroy the gloves. They even made different fabrics, so when you clench your fist, nothing happens," he explained. Shigaraki sat there in shock as he clenched and unclenched his fists. It was true, nothing was happening to the gloves. "Why would you get these for me?" Before he could answer, Midoriya heard his name being called. He saw his classmates waving at him and approaching him, some masking fear, others it was written all over their face, and yet the villain couldn't tell as he was too busy looking at the gloves. "Hey, the hour isn't up yet." He pulled out his phone to hang the call up without letting Shigaraki see. "We know, but when we found out you were left behind, we wanted to find you and go shopping together," Yamamo replied, her voice wavering. "And who's this?" "A friend from middle school, Toma," he replied. Shigaraki kept his head down but didn't say anything. He was still transfixed on the gloves. "See you later, Izuku," was all the villain said as stood up and walked away. "Shouldn't we be going after him?" Kirishima hissed. He was ready to activate his quirk and go after the villain. "No, I gave him something that might give him peace of mind, at least for now," he responded as he stood with the rest of the class and watched as Shigaraki was touching random things on his way out. "What did you do?" Iida asked, ready to talk to him about what he heard on the phone but decided against it, as it was a conversation for a later time. "I gave him the ability to touch things again. I can only imagine what it's like being quirkless, but he can't touch anyone or anything. A pair of gloves made for people who activate their quirk when all their fingers touch something came in handy," he replied. His classmates stared at him in equal parts confusion, awe, and fear. "I already reported this. The shopping mall security and police should be here soon." Iida held his phone up but then sighed and pulled Midoriya in for a hug. Then whispered so softly even Midoriya had a hard hearing it. "What have you gotten yourself into?" Midoriya giggled, pressing a kiss to his cheek, then replied in the same tone. "I don't know, All I know is they want me to join them. Midoriya pulled away and pressed a finger to his lips as if to signify to keep it quiet. I need to call my soulmates, they won't be happy to wake up though, be warned. Midoriya joked. His classmates giggled but let him have his privacy while keeping an eye on him. Hizashi wake show Yuta up, he stated with a plea in his voice. Yamada knew there was trouble when Midoriya used his full name. What happened? He asked. Midoriya looked at his classmates then turned back around. Shigaraki visited me at the mall dash. Aiza dash. It's fine, I just need you both to come in civilian clothing to not alert him if he's still in the area. Okay, my hair dash. Put it in the cute half-up bun you do. Just come as a civilian Zashi and please hurry. The line went silent for a moment, then he heard his soulmate panicking half awake and a series of banging noises and what sounded like a door opening and closing. Yuta is awake, he fell out of bed and is getting dressed now. We will be there in 20 minutes. Love you? I love you too. Midoriya hung the phone up and turned around to see the police skirting patrons out of the mall and keeping an eye on his class. Midoriya Izuku? A police officer asked. He nodded, and another approached him. What happened? Yamada and Aizawa walked to the group that was now standing in front of the vacant mall. Sir Dash, before the cop could say anything, both Aizawa and Yamada held up their pro-hero licenses and walked towards Midoriya. I'm okay, Midoriya said simply as they both wrapped their arms around him. What happened? Yamada asked the rest of the class, though they were a bit taken aback when they saw both of their teachers' appearances. Why did you want us coming in civilian clothes? There isn't anyone in the mall? Aizawa asked. Midoriya smiled wickedly as he saw his baffled classmates trying to figure out if their teachers really dressed like this. I had to. Some students are convinced you never put your hair up dash. He looked at Aizawa. And you never keep your hair down dash. He looked at Yamada. And I like seeing you both like this. Like what? Relaxed, not being heroes or teachers but my soulmates, he said simply, earning a few ahs from his classmates who were watching the scene unfold in front of them. Okay, fine. Yamada faced the class once more. I dress like a gay teen and Yuta dresses like he has some class. Surprise? He explained, though it only made Midoriya laugh. Now what happened? Aizawa asked and Midoriya started to explain their conversations, how he called Iida and bought gloves for the villain who ended up acting like a child with a new toy than a villain with a will to kill. I think he's just sad he's like me, Midoriya explained, looking at his classmates then his soulmates. If I didn't meet you guys or even make it into UA, I could be like him, angry at the world for cursing me. So when you gave him the gloves? I gave him back his sense of touch without having to worry about his quirk. I figured it's why he's mad at the world. No one wanted to come near him with a villain's quirk and we have All Might to thank for dictating what's a villain or hero quirk. He explained. His soulmates only sighed, pressing a kiss to his cheeks then looked at the police officers. See to it their parents pick them up. I assume you need Midoriya for questioning? Aizawa asked. The officer nodded and led him to a cop car and opened the door. I'm going to stay with the class. Hizashi is going to come with you and make sure nothing happens. Okay. Midoriya tugged his soulmate down for a quick kiss then walked with Yamada towards the car where they were swiftly driven back to the station. Sensei, why don't you put your hair up more often? Not a word about my hair or I give you extra homework. The questioning went quickly, with Yamada sitting next to him, holding his hand when his anxiety spiked. It had made time fly. But what I don't get is why you were nice. You could have outsmarted him, and yet he thinks you're joining the group? The detective asked. Midoriya looked at Yamada who nodded then closed and locked the door. In the upcoming months, I am supposed to join their league to take it apart from the inside. They want someone that society has beat up and abused. What better than a quirkus teen who can read quirks faster than reading a book? He explained. The detective just stared at him in shock. Who gave the okay dash? Nedzu and Hawks, he added. The detective didn't say anything about that. After all, both had high rankings in the hero world for their own things. Who was he to say he couldn't do it? I understand the danger of it, but this information cannot leave this room. I may even be on heroes' radars as a new villain who joined the league, and whatever happens, you have to attack me as if I am a true villain. Midoriya stared him down as if giving him no way to explain himself for trying to save him. I need to discuss this with Hawks or Nedzu, but for now you are free to go home with your soulmate. He responded. Midoriya stood up and bowed slightly as they walked towards the door, unlocked it, and started to head home. I don't know what I will do if I have to chase you down someday, Yamada whispered. Midoriya turned to him with a smile. I know how your quirk works, Zashi. If you use it against me, I would only suffer a few scratches. He replied. The pro rolled his eyes playfully, then grabbed Midoriya's hand gently. Just let me know when you're leaving. Let us both know, he replied. Midoriya nodded, then smiled softly. I would never keep that from you guys. After all, I need to say goodbye to my family when I do. Chapter 71. Epilogue. Summary. I want to thank you all for reading this FIC. I will give one last goodbye in the next chapter, but join me as I send this FIC off with the best epilogue I could write. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Midoriya kicked his shoes off, dropping his bag on the floor, then flopped onto the couch harshly, making his injuries sting slightly. Hello. A voice called. Midoriya didn't reply. Instead, he laid on the couch, breathing softly as to not disturb his wounds. Who's there? Another voice called. This time he groaned and started to call out a name, but instead, someone rounded the corner and they sighed. Izuku, what happened? Yamada asked, his voice a tad hoarse from overusing his quirk. Villains, was all he said, though Yamada didn't say anything. With the league gone, I thought villains would slow down. Now it seems like they want to keep fighting. It was true. Now that the league was locked up, villains have been coming out of hiding, trying to take a swing at Midoriya, the hero that went rouge, then decided being a hero was better than being a villain. Speaking of fighting, where's Sho? He asked. Yamada pointed towards the bedroom. He knew you were coming home later, so he didn't bother getting up, but I don't think he knows you're injured. He called toward the bedroom, but there were no sounds of him getting up to greet his younger soulmate. It's okay, I'm going to lay here for a bit. Go spend time with Sho Yuta. Yamada didn't say anything. Instead, he pressed a quick kiss to his lips and walked back towards the bedroom, where he shut the door. For the past few weeks, Midoriya had been getting the cold shoulder from Aizawa, and he had yet to figure out why. Everything was fine during his 18th birthday, even better when he got his pro hero license, but one day Aizawa didn't talk to him, and slowly that started to accumulate into a week, and at this point 2 weeks. Maybe they finally realized they don't want me? He muttered. Midoriya shook his head, as if trying to shake the thought, and yet, it kept persisting. The thought had been eating him away slowly, as if one day it will consume him entirely. Picking up his phone, he decided to call someone he could spend his day with, seeing how his soulmates didn't really want him there. Hey Tenya, are you and Shoto busy? Iida and Todoroki had gotten there quickly, as they were only a few minutes away from his apartment that Aizawa, Yamada, and Midoriya shared together. Iida and Todoroki had recently gotten engaged, and now share an apartment together, and Midoriya couldn't be happier for them, and yet, once again he felt like he was being left behind. Izuku, Todoroki called, getting out of the car to help him in carefully. Midoriya smiled and set his bag down next to him. How are you guys? He asked as Iida started to drive back to their apartment. The couple had been window shopping for their wedding, trying to get ideas, when Midoriya called and explained the situation. Deciding they did enough window shopping, they came to get Midoriya after hearing about the latest fight. Good, Tenya can't decide what the theme should be, so we keep looking at almost everything for the wedding. Iida shot him a quick look of hurt, then kept his eyes on the road. I find a classic wedding to be perfect, and yet he finds adding fire would be even better. He explained. Midoriya looked at Todoroki with a smirk. I wonder why, was all he said in response, which made them all laugh as Todoroki sputtered in response. What happened this time? Todoroki asked when their laughter died down. Iida pulled into the parking garage and parked the car. Turning it off, he looked back at Midoriya, who was saddened almost too quickly. Sho has yet to talk to me, and Zashi keeps taking his side, he stated. The couple shared a look, then looked back at Midoriya. I know you don't want to hear this, but maybe you should stay with us for a few days, take a break from fighting, and maybe help us plan the wedding, keep your mind off things. Iida offered. He reached over and took Midoriya's hand into his own. That's only if you want to stay with us. Say the word and we will take you home, okay? Still have my clothes in your closet? He asked. Todoroki nodded with a smile. I don't mind staying for a few days if you will have me. It's agreed. Now let's get soba for dinner. We had soba last night. Exactly, it was warm then, now it's cold. Cold soba for dinner sounds perfect, thank you Tenya. Sho Yuta, we can't do this to him. For the past 2 weeks we haven't really said a thing to Izuku and now he's probably staying with his platonic soulmates. Yamada scolded. He was pacing their room while Aizawa sat on the bed staring at him. But he knows us too well. If we didn't keep our distance he might figure out the surprise. Aizawa countered, standing up to keep Yamada steady, but he brushed his hand off. His platonic soulmates already gave him a ring. He seethed. Typically you are only bound to 2 types of soulmates, platonic and romantic, anymore, and the bonds grow weary. When a platonic soulmate gives the other a ring it signifies a lifelong bond and it's worn on their right ring finger, leaving the left for their soulmate's wedding band. They just got engaged and wanted to do it around the same time they proposed, Aizawa countered. In all actuality, he was angry they beat them to it and wanted to be the first to put a ring on Midoriya's hand instead they had, and it only made them more worried. "Show Yuta," Yamada screeched, using a little of his quirk on accident. This made Aizawa stop and look away. "We could lose him. You remember what happened during his first year, how we almost broke the bond. We are so worried he will figure out the surprise that we might lose him in the process," Yamada said gently, walking towards his nightstand to pull out a small, white box, then opened it to reveal a simple engagement ring. The band was thin and silver, but a small string of emeralds instead of the traditional diamonds sat in the middle of the ring. Yamada had spent so much time looking for something like this, and if Aizawa was acting so stubborn he drove their soulmate away again, well, he would have none of that. "You're right," he mumbled, opening the drawer to his nightstand and found the same small box, only the ring inside was black, not silver. A familiar strand of peridot crystals sat inside the ring. "But what do we do? You have Todoroki's number, right?" Aizawa had gotten the teen's number when Midoriya had been taken to the hospital and they took turns taking care of their dangerous soulmate. "What should we do?" Aizawa asked in turn. Yamada smiled and grabbed his phone, ready to make phone calls that would solve everything. It was 2 days later when Todoroki talked to Midoriya about his soulmates. Over the past few days though, the bicolored teen had been conversing with Midoriya's soulmates, trying to set up what is supposed to be the perfect day and what should be a perfect evening, but that depended on getting Midoriya dressed up and taken out of the apartment. "Izuku, today me and Tenya wanted to look at suits and the place we're going to is relatively nice, so you need me to stop wearing t-shirts and breathes and a nicer set of clothes?" he added with a laugh. Todoroki nodded. "So far so good. I had Tenya run back to your apartment to grab something nice. While he's doing that you and I can talk about something." He sat down across from him with a sigh. "Your soulmates? What about them?" he asked sadly, running a hand through his much shorter hair. After realizing how hard it was to keep his hair out of the line of fire, he opted to cut it shorter on top and had a side shaved down a bit to keep it towards one direction instead of a mess of curls. "I know me and Tenya are getting married, but have you ever thought of marrying them?" he asked quietly, as if saying anything any louder would upset him. "I think I have had ideas of marrying them since our last year at UA. Then when you and Tenya got engaged it made me want a life like that even more. But as of recently I don't." He sighed, shaking his head, then felt a hand placed upon his own. He clutched it then sighed. "I don't think they have even thought of marrying me. They are ignoring me now and I hate to think they are trying to leave me, but they aren't giving me any other ideas. It's okay, you know, if anything happens you always have a spot in our bond," Todoroki replied, walking around the table to give him a hug. "Now come on, I think Tenya left us breakfast in the kitchen and we have a big day today." "Of what?" "Wedding shopping. We finally settled on a theme thanks to you." Todoroki pressed a kiss to his forehead, thanking whatever got out there for thinking of an answer so easily without making it seem like he was lying through his teeth. After having breakfast, Iida had gotten home with Midoriya's clothes he was to wear for the day. A pair of dress breathes and a nice shirt. He thought it was too much until he realized most suit boutiques are very nice places, so he could almost be underdressed for this outing. Stepping into the bathroom, he brushed his teeth first, making sure he didn't get anything on himself, then got dressed. He tucked the shirt and then stared at his outfit, then looked up at his messy curls. "Shoto, yeah? Is my hair too messy?" Todoroki walked into the bathroom. With a can of hairspray, he lightly sprayed his roots and brushed the hair over so it wasn't falling all over the place. He carded his fingers through his curls, then nodded in satisfaction. "No," he answered and walked away. Midoriya shook his head, turned the lights off, and walked into the living room where he found Iida about ready to leave. Todoroki too was dressed up and ready to leave. Midoriya panicked slightly and realized he didn't have any nice shoes when Iida smiled and pointed to the floor by the door. His pair of dress shoes were on the ground by the front door. With a sigh, he pressed a kiss to Iida's cheek then slipped them on. "Come on," he called with a giggle as he tightened the laces on his shoes then opened the front door. "You seem more excited to leave than we are," Iida asked, shooting Todoroki a confused look knowing Midoriya couldn't see it as he was waiting outside for them. "Well, it's not every day you get to dress up and help your platonic soulmates find suits for their wedding," he called with another giggle. When Iida and Todoroki walked out of their apartment they shared a smile. Midoriya knew something was going on but he didn't know it involved him. He just thought Todoroki had a surprise for Iida or vice versa. "I don't know if I can do this," Aizawa muttered, looking at the small box in his hands then up at Yamada who was fixing his hair in the mirror. "Aizawa Shoyuda, do you want to marry this man?" he asked. Aizawa didn't hesitate to say yes, though he had nodded in response. "Okay then, you have your answer." Yamada walked back into the bedroom and sat next to him. "I am equally terrified Shoyuda but I know I love him just as much as you do. It's what's keeping me from stopping myself. I want to show him how much I love him, how much we both love him no matter how stupid we can be." He grabbed the small box that was sitting on his nightstand then sighed. "I love him Hisashi, I love you as well, I'm just worried we pushed him away again," he muttered. Yamada's lips captured his own and for a moment his anxiety, his fear just stopped. It was like this any time either Midoriya or Yamada kissed him it was as if the world had stopped for a moment and he could think. "Just shut up and propose to him. Speaking of which we have to leave if we want this to go according to plan." Yamada stood up and walked back towards the bathroom to make sure his hair was perfect, pocketed the ring box then walked towards the front door. "Come on Sho, let's get engaged. Do you not like any suits in there either?" It had been the 3 boutiques they went to and Iida and Todoroki both expressed their likes and dislikes of the outfits they had there. "Too expensive," Todoroki replied as they drove to the next store, but it was Todoroki who spoke next. "I think we should get something to eat, it's already 2, seemingly on cue. Midoriya's stomach rumbled. He felt his face darken as the heat rose to his cheeks. Thought Iida and Todoroki both laughed at this. "Late lunch it is then," Iida said as they drove towards a nice restaurant. Midoriya was too busy look out of the window to see Iida cast Todoroki an uneasy glance. Todoroki placed his hand on Iida's and nodded, as if reassuring him what they are about to do is right for their platonic soulmate. "I figured something nice since we are dressed up for it," Iida said as they parked in the parking lot. "This is where Sho, Zashi, and I eat dinner for date nights," Midoriya mumbled. Iida turned around quickly as if he had forgotten. "I'm sorry, I wanted to surprise you with lunch for coming out with us. We can go somewhere else if you want." Iida got ready to start the car again when Midoriya muttered a no. "It's okay, let's get something to eat and go back to looking for your suits," Midoriya said with a frail smile. He got out of the car then walked ahead. A part of him was hoping he would see his soulmates here but at the same time, it would hurt. "Ready?" Iida asked. Midoriya nodded and they walked in. Instantly the hostess asked how many were in their party and set them off to a table. "What do you usually get while you're here?" Todoroki asked as they sat down at a rather large table hoping Midoriya wouldn't notice the 2 extra seats. Unfortunately, he did and looked around questioningly. "Are we at the wrong table?" he asked. Sitting down slowly, Iida shook his head in response. "I forgot to tell you Bakugo and Kirishima wanted to join us for lunch today. I hope you don't mind." Midoriya smiled widely and shook his head. "Not at all, I love the surprise. I haven't been able to see them in a while," he replied then looked at Todoroki. "As for what I usually get, I like the pasta here." Iida went to say something but felt his phone vibrate. He looked down then pointed to the door. "It's Kirishima, I will be right back." He walked out as the waitress set glasses of water at the table then walked away after they said they were waiting for 2 more people. "Midoriya, I'm going to use the restroom, I will be right back," Todoroki whispered. Midoriya nodded then pulled his phone. He decided to keep his head down and draw any attention to himself and play on his phone. "Do we have the right table?" a voice asked. Before he could say anything he looked up and saw his soulmates sitting across from him. "A Bakugo and Kirishima are supposed to be coming, I'm with Tenya and Shoto right now. He muttered, feeling awkward. Just then both Iida and Todoroki walked in and sat next to him. Izuku, they wanted to talk to you about something, Iida said, holding his hand gently. Oh, I know Dash. No, Izuku, you don't know, Aizawa said simply as he set a bouquet of flowers down in front of Midoriya. Last time you said that we almost broke up. We aren't breaking up, rather we are explaining why we haven't been talking to you. If you don't want to break up then why Dash? He stopped talking then looked at Iida and Todoroki. Am I forming Dash? Not even close, Yamada added with a nervous laugh. Trying to watch their very smart soulmate figure out what was going on was better than he had hoped. So then what is happening here? Todoroki was the one to stand up. He pulled Midoriya's seat back and guided him up. Close your eyes. Midoriya cast him a glance of confusion but did so anyway. The flowers were placed in his hands as his eyes were screwed shut. A series of footsteps were heard and he kept moving his head to hear what was happening but he couldn't figure it out. Giggles were heard from a few girls then they stopped. All of a sudden cheers and whoops were heard. Open your eyes Izuku, Aizawa whispered. Midoriya at first had looked up to see his former classmates standing in front of him then he looked down to see both of his soulmates on one knee holding a ring in each hand. We know how smart you are so like idiots we didn't say a thing to you in case you figured it out. Midoriya almost dropped the flowers in hand. One hand reached up to cover his mouth as tears were slowly falling. Izuku Midoriya, we have known we have wanted to marry you since your last year in UA. We always talked about it but we never had the courage to put it into action until last month. Though it was Shuta's bright idea to stay silent about everything, I will say I followed because you ruin birthday surprises as easily as you breathe. A chorus of laughs and giggles were heard in front of him but he couldn't look up to see his classmates. He could only smile widely and laugh as his soulmates waited with bated breath to ask him. Okay 1 2 3 dash. Izuku, will you marry us? They had said at the same time. Yamada was the one who had counted it off as neither could say it at the same time. You are idiots, he whispered leaning down to press a kiss to their lips. Is that a yes? Aizawa asked, a tad confused. Midoriya held his face in his hands then looked to Yamada who wore the same confusion. Yes, I love you both so much of course I would marry you. Cheers and sniffles were heard from his former classmates. Even some pros had come to witness their union. As marrying 3 people were almost impossible, this would suffice. I can't wait to spend the rest of my life with you both, Midoriya whispered as they both slid the rings on his left hand. This is just the beginning, Aizawa replied in the same tone pressing a kiss to his lips then peppered them across his face. Get a room. One of his classmates had shouted, causing them to laugh. How did you guys set this up? He asked. Aizawa and Yamada both looked at Iida and Todoroki who were standing behind them, Todoroki crying, just a tad of course. They called me and I realized over the years at UA we were all there to witness everything about your relationship, well not everything of course. This earned some laughs from their group of onlookers. But when things got hard, or when you were ecstatic about something, we were always there to help you and you helped us become great heroes. I had pulled strings to keep them out of the streets even if for a few hours. Everyone is here Izuku, we are all here to see you off on the next chapter of your life. I don't dash. Tears welled up in his eyes once again. Stop crying you dumb nerd. Bakugo walked towards him, walking by his soulmates, and hugged him roughly. I know how happy these extras make you. He shifted his attention to them. Don't hurt him, we will all effing kill you. Katsuki, Kirishima called. The explosive teen glared at him a little longer then let him go and walked back to his soulmate who held him gently. So what now? Midoriya asked. Yamada sighed and pressed a kiss to his lips. Well we have lunch first then. Well this is your day, what do you want to do? He asked. All eyes were on Midoriya who looked at his lovers with such care and fondness it was almost impossible not to see it. It's our day, and I say we spend it all together as a family, one last time. That sounds perfect. Aizawa pressed a kiss to his temple. I love you both, Midoriya whispered as people took their seats. Aizawa and Yamada looked at each other and shared a kiss then looked at him. And we love you, no matter what happens, we are just idiots who fell too hard for the quirkless boy that caught the attention of everyone he was around, Yamada replied. Aizawa sighed and nodded. I want to say that no matter what happened in the past, I will always love you both. Communicating wasn't always my strong suit and because of you, I am learning. So thank you for that. Aizawa looked at Yamada, then Midoriya, who nodded. Then I would add that I am happy in some weird way that I wrote my notebooks because it was the one that had your page show Yuta that caught your attention. As creepy as they were, they somehow brought us together. Aizawa nodded, laughing at the memory, as well as Yamada, who had found his page later on. Come on, they are waiting for us to sit down. Midoriya tugged them back to their seats and realized Iida and Todoroki are now sitting across from them. Todoroki stood up and picked up a glass of champagne the waitstaff had set at their tables while they were talking. To Aizawa-sensei, Yamada-sensei, and Izuku, may you have a wonderful marriage, and we are here for you no matter what. Todoroki then sighed. To the future? To the future,